Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking part. I think we're just letting in participants now. My name is Ashley Wellens. I'm an assistant professor in the Negotiations, Organizations, and Markets Unit. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Harvard Kennedy School Behavioral Insights Group. It's my pleasure to introduce this next panel on behavioral insights in industry careers. It's actually our first panel. We've had PhD mentorship sessions this morning, as this conference is part of a day-long PhD-focused conference at HKS that happens every year, and it's our inaugural virtual conference. So the panel today is meant to give insight into job opportunities and pathways in industry for people with behavioral science backgrounds across different types and career stages. So I will be handing it over to my colleague Mike Luca in just 1 minute to introduce the panel and the panelists on the call today. And I look forward to hearing from them in a moment. One quick note of housekeeping: given this is a PhD-focused conference, there'll be no Q&A except from students who will be asking Q&A over Slack. So just as a quick point, the Q&A is closed for today. So I'm going to hand this over to Mike, who can kick off the panel.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. Welcome everybody to our panel on putting behavioral insights into practice. We're going to dive into things, but first I wanted to give a little bit of context about how to think about this panel. So I preface this with a general statement, which is that in my view, and I think many people in this room would agree with this, is that it's been an exciting time for behavioral science over the last decade or so. Within academia, we've seen research continue to grow, coming from multiple fields, including economics, psychology, OB, marketing. We've also seen behavioral insights increasingly shape practice as well. So this has occurred through a few different channels. We've seen the rise of field research and increasing collaborations between academics and organizations. We've also seen increased hiring of behavioral scientists into companies and government. And this has also happened in a couple of different ways. We've seen the rise of nudge units like the UK BIT unit. Two of the panelists here have had experience there as well. We've seen organizations like marketing companies bring in behavioral scientists to help shape marketing and PR and communication strategies. We've also seen more traditional companies, banks, also tech companies hiring behavioral scientists to work on a variety of problems. So today, what we're going to do is think about navigating the job path as a behavioral scientist. We're going to put academic jobs aside for today and focus on the industry job landscape. And to do that, we've got 5 terrific panelists who are all going to bring different perspectives to share with us. If you have questions, you could enter them into the Q&A panel, and then we're going to surface them as we go along to the panelists. Let me just introduce the panelists. They'll each give a brief introduction of themselves and the role that behavioral science plays in their organizations, and then we'll dive into questions about navigating a job as a behavioral scientist. The 5 panelists are Felicia Joy, the SVP and Group Head of Behavioral Science at Edelman, Liz Linos, who is a faculty member at UC Berkeley School of Policy and was previously working with the Behavioral Insights team, Divya Nair, who is a director at ID Insight, Julie O'Brien, who's the Director of Behavior Change at WW, and Robbie Tilliard, who is a partner experience team at Humu, and prior to that had also worked at the Behavioral Insights team. So without further ado, I'd like to start with Felicia Joy. Felicia, thanks for joining us on this panel. Can you just give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself and the role that behavioral science plays in your organization?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mike, for having me on the panel. It's great to be here with such an esteemed panel of accomplished people. I work at Edelman, which is the world's largest communications firm in terms of revenue. So I started behavioral science there about a year ago. We officially launched. And I graduated from Harvard with a master's in education and human development and psychology, but I focused very intentionally on behavioral science, applied behavioral science, while I was there taking classes at the Kennedy School of Government, because I knew that I wanted to bring the practice into industry and into my profession. So my professional history has been public relations and marketing, which of course, the basis of everything we do in the field is behavioral science, is psychology, is understanding what makes people receive or reject a message and act or not act based upon that message. So at Edelman, we apply behavioral science in myriad ways. We've worked on everything from trying to motivate marijuana cultivators in California to sign up for legal licensure, to things like working with financial advisors, experimenting with tools that will prompt their clients to save more towards retirement and have more empathy for their future selves, to things like working on culture, companies dealing with toxic culture or cultures that simply aren't working to drive their business strategy, how to shift all people. We know it's difficult enough to change one person's behavior, but shift a whole entire organization's behavior toward a goal. I'll get into over the course of the conversation challenges we have in doing this work, but that's kind of a snapshot of the way we apply behavioral science at Edelman.
Great, thanks. And can I just ask a little bit of a follow-up on that, which is I'm trying to get a sense of how you knew that you wanted to go into behavioral science, and how explicit was your role about hiring someone with a background in behavioral science versus you thinking that it was a good fit to go there?
Sure. So I knew I wanted to go into behavioral science because since I had this background in communications and marketing, as things have become more data-driven and evidence-based in the world, that has been a faster adoption in marketing than it has been in communications and public relations. So marketing, because of, for instance, digital advertising, can prove a direct causal link from their work, a digital ad, someone clicks on it, clicks through to a website, makes a purchase. They can take full credit or attribution for that revenue. Communications, we might pitch a story to media, get that story placed, people read that story, and maybe we influence their perception. Maybe we do actually prompt them to go buy something, but because there's been a lack of technology in that space, we haven't been able to prove that link. So I started looking for ways to prove the efficacy and impact of our work. I worked for some tough CEOs who were very data focused, and I happened upon behavioral science as a way of running experiments where we control for all but one variable that we're looking to influence. And through experimentation and being rigorous, we're able to more so prove the effects of our work. And that's why I knew I was specifically interested in behavioral science and taking it back to improve the way that communications and public relations are done.
Great, thanks, Felicia. I think this also touches on an important issue, which is that when we think about behavioral science in practice, we've seen two related evolutions in the field. One is the rise of using behavioral insights specifically, and the other is bringing more data and experiments into organizations to test and see what's going to work in a given context. Yeah, Liz, did you want to give an introduction of yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's so great to be on this panel, and I'm excited to learn from all my fellow panelists as well. I'm Elizabeth Linos. As Mike mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at UC Berkeley right now. Before that, I was head of research for the Behavioral Insights team in North America. And before that, I worked in government. Just like Felicia, actually, I entered the field not because I explicitly knew I wanted to do behavioral science, but because I loved another field. I love data-driven government. And I was really excited about figuring out how to make government services work better. And it turned out at the time, I was doing my PhD at the Kennedy School, and I was running some RCTs like good randomistas did with the US government. The government closed down for one of its many shutdowns. And I anxiously said, okay, where in the world is there a government that's doing good RCTs? Like, where in the world can we do data-driven government right now? Because the US government, I don't know what's going to happen. And someone introduced me to David Halpern at BIT. And my initial introduction to that was, okay, let me just come and do a few experiments. I love government. Let me do my little PhD. I knew a little bit about behavioral science. I had studied it a little bit at the Kennedy School. But I didn't think it was going to be a long-term relationship. Turns out I fell in love with doing behavioral science in government and stuck with it. And part of it was because of the promise that behavioral science was offering at the time for governments, to be able to do something practical that has impact, to be able to show the impact, like Felicia said. And that's turned into kind of a long-term career. In BIT North America, which we can talk about, we've done work with more than 50 state and local governments. It's super exciting to be doing it at the local level and working with local government leaders who are interested in using behavioral science. And now at Berkeley, I run a lab called the People Lab that essentially does the same type of work at the intersection of public management and behavioral science. So my projects start with a government question or a public management question, but often the tools that we use to answer that question are behavioral science tools. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's terrific and a fascinating path that you've chosen. And one thing that intrigues me, and I'd love to hear more about, is you have managed to keep one foot in practice, helping to put behavioral insights into organization, and the other foot in academia. So you may be uniquely well positioned to give a little bit of insight into how these two paths differ, and what do you find exciting about each of them?
Yeah, I hope to continue to have one foot in both of those worlds, and happy to answer questions about that. My kind of overarching goal is to have an impact, and I see, or I kind of experience that impact in the world of government. So there's many ways that you can experience impact. People can have an impact in their lives and in the world in many ways. Academia is certainly one of those paths. For me, it really matters that I'm doing work that can be implemented by governments. And one thing I loved about working outside of academia was the speed at which we could do projects, because you can really see the impact of your work. Ultimately, I decided that for now I want to be in academia because, you know, this is such a new field. Sometimes we forget that 10 years ago, nobody knew what behavioral science was, right? And so I still think there are a lot of questions that we don't know the answer to. And one thing that I was worried about was that we were getting really excited about one RCT, and then governments across the world were scaling it up without a lot of, you know, in-depth substantive knowledge about that area. And in my space, so I work a lot on people in government, that's even more so the case. So we know very, very little from the behavioral science angle about how to recruit, retain, and support workers. And so I thought it was necessary to do some more academic work in that space. It turns out it is possible to do both, so we can talk about that later in the panel. And there's a growing crop of academics, many of which are organizing this conference, that are really able to link solid academic work with what organizations and governments need. And so for those of you who are PhD students who are being trained, I think that is a model that you can look to. It's going to be a much more frequently used model, I think, in the future.
And one more follow-up question, which is that there's been this cropping up of behavioral insights teams around the globe. This has happened both in companies and in governments. Now, you had the opportunity to help lead the team for BIT when it started in the US. Could you just say a little bit about what that job was like for people who are thinking about going down that path?
I love that job. I love BIT North America deeply. So it was incredibly fast-paced. We had a lot of things going for us. We launched a team in the US, but everyone knew, or a lot of people knew, the nudge unit in the UK. And so it was the perfect mix of a startup with a lot of credibility and gravitas. And so in some ways, we could hit the ground running with a lot of work with What Works Cities, which is a Bloomberg Philanthropies program. In the end, and this again, it goes back to what Felicia already said, in the end, what we found is that there's a huge community of people who care about data-driven work and care about evidence-based work, and they believed us as behavioral scientists, not because of the behavioral science, but because of the RCTs. And so once you start showing impact in areas that are kind of really critical, you know, we worked on everything from, you know, how do you get people to pay their fines, which people, you know a lot about now, to, you know, how do we think about diversity in police recruitment, or how do we think about the opioid crisis? So really trying to get into some meaty policy areas. The reason behavioral science approach kind of made sense was because we could back it up with the data. And so we ended up joining essentially a network of cities and government leaders and others who are already pretty data-driven, and we're just as excited about behavioral science as we are. And the job itself was super fast-paced. So I was doing my PhD, just to give you a sense. We signed a contract, and I want to say I was not responsible for this contract with What Works Cities, where we were doing 3 RCTs per year per city and doing 6 cities a year. So for those of you who are doing 1 RCT over 5 years of a PhD program, that's the norm. Doing what we were trying to do was, for an academic, mind-boggling, but it happened, and it happened because we had a great team of people working really, really fast. But the speed was basically set a new bar for how you can do RCTs.
Great, thanks. Divya, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your path?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Just to give you some context, I'm a director at ID Insight. I'm based in Delhi, and it's evening here. So ID Insight is a global advisory that uses data and evidence for decision making, and our goal is to kind of fight poverty. And so we're very mission oriented in terms of social impact. And behavioral sciences kind of fits into, like, it's a sub part of what we do or what I'd focus on. But, you know, very much, it has been very useful. And I can talk a little bit about my path and, you know, where we've used it. In terms of, you know, my personal kind of trajectory, I did, you know, a master's at Princeton a long time ago and happened to take courses with Danny Kahneman and, you know, Eldar Shafir and all of them. But as Elizabeth was saying, it was the early days. And at that point, you know, it was just very exciting to hear about this new paradigm. And now, you know, after that, I did a PhD in public health. And basically kind of combining both of these, I kind of understood the importance of, you know, behavior change and how it really is such a sticky point. And now specifically working very closely with government, it's become, you know, it's really become very important in terms of both the supply and the demand sides. So, you know, getting governments might be able to roll out, you know, whether it's bank accounts or whether it's a range of maternal and health services or financial products, etc. But that last mile of actually getting people to use it is very sticky. And, you know, that's where the rubber hits the road very often. And so we're very involved with that. ID Insight is working closely with the central government and with key ministries, so Ministry of Women and Child Development, Ministry of Agriculture. We work with the central, like, planning ministry, etc. And, you know, we've used behavioral insights, and we can talk more about it later, in a range of our work, including RCTs, but not only. So, you know, I can talk a little bit about that too, is that it just, like, you know, this lens has been very useful in terms of understanding where the bottlenecks are and how they can be addressed. And the piece that's really important is combining the evidence with the insights to understand, like, what works and what doesn't work. So I can stop there.
Great, and pushing a little bit further on this last comment, using the evidence to know what works and doesn't work. And I'm thinking in part about the backgrounds of students who are in the session and some of their comparative advantage in bringing both behavioral insights and experience to different organizations. How much of what your partners are looking for is based on bringing evidence specific to them? So a new RCT, a new analysis of data they have, and how much of it is expecting you to be the expert in behavioral science and bringing known frameworks that you're kind of drawing from the literature to them to say how that would work in their context?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say it's a combination, definitely, you know, having experts, and now there is this kind of core of experts that's being built. And, you know, there are these numerous nudge units across the world. And, you know, I think there's a nice nice critical mass of people and evidence and knowledge that is expected, that, you know, that governments will draw from. But but governments are also very savvy in terms of understanding the importance of the context, especially when we're talking about behavioral barriers and, you know, solutions to address these barriers. It makes a lot of sense to ask, what about my, you know, context? Will it be applicable here? And so this kind of testing and, you know, implementing and iterating is very much like accepted and important. And I do think most governments would be skeptical if you just kind of brought
a ready-made or a cookie cutter kind of approach. But it helps to say that, this has worked in many other contexts and this is how it worked and these were the channels.
Great. And thinking about your transition from a discipline of public health to working in an organization, how do you think about the generalization of results? And what I'm trying to get at is, if you're in public health, should you think about you being a good fit for public health? Or is there a lot of switching between public health, education, and other areas, thinking about some of the general themes and toolkits that you've developed along the way?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess for doctoral students, my sense is that, like a PhD really does, and maybe public health in particular and public policy, it is a flexible kind of toolkit and framework and of rigor that you bring to everything that you approach. And it is kind of, customizable. Having said that, I do think that zooming in on public health itself is probably easier for me, right? Like I do have that training and all of that I bring into public health, where I have more of a familiarity. But it has worked in other sectors. I've worked in agriculture, financial inclusion, sanitation, a whole range. And there are cross learnings, and it has been I've enjoyed it.
And the cross learnings are mainly around the empirical skills, or are they mainly around the topics and generalizable of the same types of behavioral phenomenon?
I think definitely the empirical skills are transferable in many ways. The cross learnings also in terms of human behavior, right? I mean, questions of like using, identity, what kind of messaging works, whether it's questions of incentives and motivation and all those pieces. In fact, we're doing quite a lot of work on frontline workers. And what we're finding is across sectors, whether you're talking about sanitation workers or health workers, or even in financial inclusion, there are these business correspondents. A lot of the lessons are transferable and the frameworks are usable across them.
Great, thanks. And so in the interest of time, let's transition to the next introduction. So Julie, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on and what your background was?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here and nice meeting everyone and chatting. So I am currently the Director of Behavior Change at WW International, which is formerly Weight Watchers. I've been there for about a year, and I'm starting an applied behavioral science function, mainly to support the product organization. And before that, I was at Duke leading the health team at the Center for Advanced Hindsight. So that was a really amazing, wonderful opportunity where I got to do kind of a mix of academic basic research and also work with lots of large organizations, doing field interventions and also just sort of exploratory analysis. And then before that, I was at OPower, where I started the behavioral research function. And then before that, I did a PhD in social psych. Very brief.
Great. And in all these areas, have you been bringing in the idea of using behavioral insights in the organization? Because I'm trying to get a sense of, did you go in and they knew that they wanted a behavioral scientist? Or did you say, hey, I think that behavioral science could play an important role here. Here are 5 ways that might manifest.
So I think that it often happens kind of simultaneously like that. And obviously every organization is different, but I started my career at OPower, which was based in behavioral science. The core product was this social norms comparison that was, based in this study that Cialdini did many years ago. And so they sort of had that philosophy baked into the foundation of the company, but it hadn't been used in the process of product design for anything new. So when I got there, it was like my first exposure to tech and my first exposure to UX and sort of the way that standard tech companies develop new products. And it was really funny to me because we were testing every end product through these massive RCTs in the field, and we had like amazing econometrics and amazing data, but we weren't using RCTs or experiments in the development of anything new. And so there was sort of like people were already excited about behavioral science, so they knew it was something that would be useful and interesting to apply, but hadn't quite figured out how we apply that to the product design process. And this was, I guess, in 2013, so there weren't a lot of models at that point for how we can do this in tech. And so I had just come out of grad school and I was like, well, why aren't we running experiments? Let's just run some experiments, or let's, survey people and then connect that to their actual data, because this is so amazing that we have all these cool things. And so, there was a little bit of just tapping into excitement that other folks had, and then doing little things that could demonstrate the power of that tool, and then, getting more buy-in and more excitement. And then after you do that a few times, then people want it to be a real formal thing. And so, some of it is, tapping into things that everybody's already talking about, but then building on it to sort of show the value that you can do when you do it more systematically and, across the board.
And when you think about the value of experiments, you sort of touch on two different things. One is just learning when you didn't know that something works. And the other was kind of, you had a sense that something might work, but helping to bring that excitement to others who maybe didn't know as much about behavioral science, or didn't, or were perhaps skeptical about some of the things that you were implementing. Which of those did you see as the key role of running experiments in the context that you've worked?
So I think that demonstrating what works and, getting everybody sort of excited and anticipating the outcome is really an important piece of it. But I view experiments and sort of the value that behavioral science can bring more broadly in terms of, we can do lab experiments in industry where it's actually a really great way to develop something that could be, high risk, high reward. You don't want to put tech resources behind it. And so you can do something where it's a hypothetical scenario and sort of push the boundaries a little bit on what might be acceptable. And so bringing your partners and your team members into that kind of process gets people to sort of push their own boundaries a little bit about what they would think about for design or for messaging, because it's that low risk setting where you can sort of play around with all sorts of things. So part of the value for me was in giving other people this tool that I understood that could then help them be more creative and more innovative in a way where there's really low risk, aside from time and small costs, but you don't have to build anything real. And so you can just be a lot more creative and try out lots of different things before you commit to something.
Great. And can you give an example of a project that you're working on now or worked on in one of the other organizations?
Yeah, I think, so one of the things that I'm working on currently is, and I can't go into a ton of specific detail, but we're really interested in thinking about how we can build community online, which is something that lots and lots of organizations are now thinking about. And so it's been really exciting to take some of the kind of basic ideas from social science more broadly, and then think about how do you translate that into a digital experience. And then, experimenting within an online community also offers lots of new challenges in terms of contamination, and how do you sort of create like microcosms that you can then introduce new ideas through. And so we're working on, figuring some of those questions out. But I think there's a really interesting opportunity now where, there's certain things that academics have been looking at in terms of positivity resonance, for example, and how do you help people have shared emotions at the exact same time. And traditionally, we've thought about that as happening in person, where people can see each other and they can understand the body language of other people. And now we're trying to recreate that in a digital experience. And so we have to, again, be like a lot more creative and think about how do we do that? What are the things that really matter in that shared experience that we can then replicate online?
Great. Thanks, Julie. Now, Robbie, did you want to give us a little bit about your background and your roles and the role that you're playing at Humu right now?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So I work in partner experience and people science at a startup called Humu, and I'm helping expand the team and the product and the business in Europe. Before Humu, I worked at the behavioral insights team in the UK, where Liz actually interviewed me once for a role. She rejected me from that role, but luckily for me, she forwarded me on to the United Kingdom, where I helped lead our work focusing on organizational behavior, employment, and labor markets. And so at Humu, our product uses behavioral and data science to help make work better. And underlying this is a pretty simple insight that I'm sure most of the people joining will be familiar with, which is once those fundamentals in the workplace, such as safety, salary, predictability, are addressed, how do you help make people happier? And it turns out those perks don't matter. And so Laszlo Bock, who's one of our co-founders and used to be the head of HR at Google for a decade, says Specifically, it's not the lobster in the cafeteria that made people happier at Google. It was actually things such as autonomy, mastery, belonging, and purpose. And these are things that are based in the psychological literature and the behavioral literature, but also things that every employer can access. So specifically, using data we collect through surveys and from HR systems, we nudge people to encourage them to be happier, more productive, achieve their goals, and so on. And as a people science team, we really act as the R&D engine room for the product. So we're thinking about the science and the evidence that drives our product and trying to answer some simple questions such as how might we drive behavior change at scale in organizations? And then how can we also prove our product is driving business value, which is actually a lot harder, I think, than sometimes it seems, particularly if you look at a lot of the literature, it focuses on easier environments like call centers and so forth, rather than maybe more knowledge worker type environments. The reason I got interested in this space was I actually grew up in a small country town in Australia. When I was young, the largest employer left that town, and my family wasn't that impacted, but the town was. And this set me on a path thinking about the importance of work for individuals and communities. And initially, this made me think a lot about economic growth and the importance of growth to drive jobs and kind of more classic economic frameworks. Actually, at grad school, where I focused on a master's in economic history, I realized economics really only had two solutions for when there's a major job loss in the community, and that's when that's normally a person will leave the labor force, or they have to move or get on your bike, as it was called here in the UK in the 70s. But I thought there has to be a deeper things to do, like around behaviors, such as how do you broach that subject of a steel worker becoming a nurse? How do you think about how people can get additional skills? And how do you actually broach the subject of the importance of community, but also the importance of moving to opportunity?
Great. And how much are you thinking about these as generalizable principles that then you could put into a bunch of places versus really context-specific things where you have an intensive process in any given organization?
So I think we use those fundamentals of behavioral science to apply richly across organizations. But then the power of what we do over time is, and the power of using data and algorithms, is you can actually start to contextualize and individualize. And so I think that's still, that's kind of the path we're on, which is how do you create kind of an experience which actually can be contextualized to the individual in the organization, but it is not actually a people-intensive role. It's actually a tech-intensive role.
And when you say that you want to prove to organizations, is that via RCTs as well, or are there other things that you're looking at to show the impact?
Yeah, so we do run RCTs with organizations to prove the effect of our product. I think one thing that's interesting, and maybe other panelists have some thoughts on this too, or you might, Mike, as well, which is we're often like, we've run various experiments with Humu where we've proven a step change in productivity from the application of our product. Surprisingly, sometimes I would have thought if you walked into a CEO's office and said, look at this graph, it improves productivity by 8%, they would say, wow, here's your check, no problem. But that doesn't always happen. So there's something kind of that you have to do. Is the RCTs are only part of the picture. The story, the narrative, the credibility, the belief has to sit around it as well.
Say a little bit more. What's kind of a challenge if you were to come in and say, here's the impact on the outcome that you cared about? Is it skepticism about the RCT? Is it fear of just too hard to measure in the data?
I think what will often happen is, one, someone will say, well, that was a call center. That doesn't apply to our knowledge workers over here, even though probably at least the general principles are very similar. And then I think second, they might start to say, well, actually, it's because we have an amazing leader in that call center, and that can't be replicated. Or there's another variable that can't be replicated. And even though you're trying to construct a generalizable story, even in those organizations themselves, there will always be people bringing up things that are legitimate and credible, but ultimately the RCT is still the best evidence you have of effectiveness. I think the other more general problem is, even as a product, taking that evidence from one organization to another organization and saying, look, we've proven this somewhere else, even that can be difficult. And this is also something that I'm sure Liz and others faced, and I faced it when I was at Behavioral Insights team as well, where you say, well, this worked at a local council here. It should be generally applicable here. Let's run a test. Let's actually try to understand if it is working. But like we could probably go for scale this time rather than like a smaller pilot or something like that. But even that is a more difficult a story. So I think there's a narrative here of just saying the RCTs and the academic basis is a big part of it. But I would also encourage PhD students who are joining to think about what is the story of kind of their research and how do they tell that story that means that that they can actually kind of convince others to use their research long term.
And so I think this touches on a great set of issues that I think people going into organizations have to think about. So including how much does something actually generalize, to the extent that you're running an RCT, how familiar with this methodology, is there too much or too little skepticism of results in different contexts? And as a behavioral scientist going into an organization, how do you think about which insights you could just pour it over, which things need to be tailored to any given context? And I think, Robbie, one of the things you are touching on is the ability of bringing in more data and perhaps targeting results to see if you could use machine learning or other approaches to get at some of the important heterogeneity across contexts, and how you can kind of bring that to the table as part of the value you have in an organization. Yeah, it's super interesting stuff. Now, I want to kind of take a step back from our personal roles and experiences and talk a little bit more broadly about the job market for behavioral scientists. There are a lot of people on this trying to get a sense of what do the jobs look like, what is the landscape, are there companies that are especially active? So I'd be curious to get any of the perspectives from panelists on what that landscape looks like. So if you're a behavioral scientist thinking about what might be a fit, what kinds of jobs there are, do you have advice people might think about that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here to your question, Mike, and also because I saw some from the participants asking if they need to be strong statisticians or can they be more, quote, ideas people. I think there are opportunities for both of those poles and every where in between. So my strength as a behavioral scientist is behavioral design, like designing the interventions, designing the tactics we would deploy that would actually shift behavior. So we, at Edelman, where I work, we have in-house statisticians. So that's a resource for me. But even if you end up working somewhere where you don't have that, you can partner with academics. We've talked already earlier this morning about the growing partnership between industry and academia. So you can partner with academics who have that strength of statistical methods if you don't, if you are skilled in the other areas. So at Edelman, like I said, there's the opportunity for people who are more behavior design oriented. I think I see jobs regularly where there are opportunities for people who are more interested in field experimentation. So I think there are opportunities across the board, no matter what your strengths are.
I think it's really helpful to also be able to speak all of those languages. So I think behavioral science is really unique because we can sort of play a UX role, we can play a data science role, but being able to leverage all of those different skill sets and at least understand when they're valuable and when, how you can partner with the different sort of arms within the industry can be super helpful in positioning, you're not just pigeonholed into this one set of expertise of knowing statistics but not understanding user experience research. It can offer a lot of flexibility to sort of understand that whole landscape.
The only thing to add is exactly to this point. Sometimes if you start looking for jobs, if you're looking for jobs that are titled behavioral science, you won't find a lot. And that's because a lot of these organizations are led by, people like us who don't have degrees in behavioral science because it didn't exist as a term at the time, right? And so you'll see a lot of people, there's innovation teams across government that will ask for someone who has data science and human-centered design background, or someone who's really good at behavior change, or someone who's just really data-driven. But if you go to them and you say, look, I'm a behavioral scientist, they'll be super excited. It's just that it's not yet as common to see that as a job title. And that's changing very, very rapidly. But I think there are a lot of jobs that would be perfect for a behavioral scientist that the employer doesn't yet know that they would be perfect for a behavioral scientist until you go tell them.
I think this touches on an interesting thing, which is that as a behavioral scientist, you're both trying to figure out, would you be for a behavioral role, but you're also going into organizations trying to say, here's why you need to bring more behavioral scientists into organizations. I think this is, that's been happening as more people are transitioning back and forth between academia and industry as well, and just thinking about what role different disciplines might play in an organization. Now, are there specific sectors that you would point to as hiring a lot of behavioral scientists? Marketing, Felicia, seems like it might be one. Liz and Robbie, I think the bits of the world are clearly hiring heavily. My understanding is that companies like Walmart and also tech companies are doing a lot of hiring from economics, psychology, behavioral science more broadly.
Yeah, and we have a lot of clients in the financial services industry who are very interested in behavioral science. And obviously, there are a lot of behavioral economists who work in that space already. But I'm starting to see, like Liz said, more people becoming savvy about how this can be applied. And at Edelman, we work across all industries, across brands, health, and corporate. So from the C-suite to product development teams. And we see interest across the board. So it is, like Julie said, being able to speak the language of the client or your employer and talk about behavioral science in the context of what they're trying to achieve. I also think folks should be really clear about if you want to be the hands-on practitioner day-to-day or in a management role, because what you'll be doing day-to-day is very different if you're managing behavioral scientists versus actually doing the science yourself.
I think one other industry that's also really great for behavioral science is healthcare and all of the sort of related industries that go along with that, like pharma and vaccination and even, you know, like on the ground public health, but health insurance companies are starting to really adopt behavioral science either through partnerships with academia or their own kind of, you know, nudge units. So that's a really interesting and growing area that I think will benefit a lot, obviously benefit a lot from behavioral science.
And I think, like people have already said earlier, in government, that's where you'll most often probably see the term behavioral insights or behavioral science. And you see that in the UK, particularly with the Financial Conduct Authority or the tax authority here. But in industry, you've got to search a bit harder. So in financial services, it might be more prominent. But I think it's more about searching for what those tools are that they're asking for, exactly as Liz said. So experimentation, data science, product development, behavioral scientists have a lot to add here.
Great. So now thinking a little bit more about the job search and navigation process, I think this gives a good sense of the industries where behavioral scientists are becoming increasingly active. How does somebody go about finding organizations that are hiring? So not obviously everyone could do kind of like the standard search and look on job boards, but do you have other advice for which market you might look at? How do you just go employer to employer? Is it about networking at conferences? Like, what are the things people should be thinking about?
So I'll jump in here. There's a guy named Samuel Salzer who has a newsletter called Habit Weekly. So if you go to habitweekly.com, every week in that newsletter, I have found that they curate from a variety of sources jobs that are open in the field. And I've found that to be a pretty consistent way to find out about places that are hiring. I think someone else was jumping in. I think Divya was jumping in too.
Yeah, sorry, I think there's a slight lag in my internet. So I was saying that, kind of answering a couple of your questions earlier too, is there is a lot of interest in government, I think. And so, organizations like ours who are working with government, we are very interested in kind of collaborating with government and kind of pulling in people who have this interest. Having said that, in terms of skill sets, I do think, it's kind of important to collaborate with others, like design teams, with human-centered design, which my sense is not everybody has everything. And so having that openness of being able to say what you can and cannot do is useful. And if you're the kind of person who's had this experience at grad school, in terms of going through all the steps of doing some of this work, it is very valuable. I think there's a question on the chat in terms of local versus national government, what's the interest? And it is becoming more local too. So there's just that much more demand going forward. And I think that, there's a lot of, you can bring a lot of creativity, innovation, etc. when you set up this kind of thinking and potentially a unit or, whatever the level of engagement is.
And let's push a little bit more on skills. So we've got a lot of doctoral students attending this, thinking about what classes they should be taking, what skills they should be investing in, what types of things they should be trying to learn. If they want a career going into industry and behavioral science, what are the things that they should be doing now to prepare for that?
So one thing that I have thought a lot about recently is just having super solid understanding of the fundamentals behind behavioral science. So I did my PhD in social psych, and it was a very basic social psych program, but it's ended up being extremely valuable to me because I can go into any context and sort of understand what's driving behaviors. So I think, there's a question of are you going to be an expert in incentives, or are you going to be an expert in this other kind of tool that we have? But if you have this really solid foundation that, you understand how judgment and decision making works, regardless of the context, regardless of the tool that you're using to try and shift decision making, then you can sort of go anywhere and do anything. And it makes you a lot more flexible and able to work on all kinds of different things, which, I think is also a nice way to think about your career in terms of you don't have to just do health or just do finance. You can work on any of those things if you understand that fundamental human behavior process that's kind of behind everything.
I would add that, there's three kind of skills that everyone's been talking about. So one is the data and the stats. The second is the behavioral science and the social science. And the third is policy or domain expertise. And obviously as a PhD student, you've chosen to go deep, right, already. And you have this opportunity to get more technical, I think. So I think as a PhD student, depending on kind of to Felicia's point of whether you really want to go into a management role or a more technical role, I think you've already made some of those choices to some extent when you're starting to enter into a PhD program, because clearly you love the detail and you want to get deep into that knowledge. So I guess I would be encouraging students to, even if it's not their home base, to at least invest in those data skills, those technical skills, because this is the best time to do it when they're a student, and it will really help them land interesting roles particularly with technology firms.
I have a this might be very controversial, so take it with a grain of salt. I was thinking back to kind of who I hired and who I hire now, even in academia, and I significantly overweight people who have done it. So that sounds like a weird thing to say because you are spending, years of your life getting those technical skills, and there's no substitute for that. If you don't have substance, either on the kind of data side or on the behavioral science side, this isn't going to solve your problem. But if there are a lot of people who have really good technical skills, the amount you learn from having run even a failed RCT with a real partner, whether it's an organization or a government agency, is just something that isn't highly valued in PhD programs, I think, but is incredibly useful if you want to get a job in this space, both in academia and outside of academia. So I would urge you to if you had to pick to take another really cool class or spend some time doing work in the field, I would pick doing work in the field.
And if I could just quickly echo Julie and Liz and a couple of things to emphasize. Doing the work, so even if you do your own small experiments, that is even very valuable. But also having a great command of the basics, because especially if you work in an agency like I work in, where there are many different companies coming to the organization for help, you'll be asked a question and you'll have a day or 2 days maybe to come up with an initial direction. You won't have time for an extensive literature review. So having the literature inside, so to speak, and having a command of it, and at least being directionally correct and buying yourself more time to go research to find further answers is incredibly helpful and necessary to be successful in industry where business moves very quickly and people in some ways think we're magicians, and it's okay to dispel them of that myth. We're not magicians, but they do expect a certain velocity of insight. And so you have to have the information inside of you to have those insights quickly.
Great, thanks. We just have a couple of minutes left in the panel, so I just wanted to give anybody who had final advice they wanted to share a minute to share with the group. So for our students who are going on the market or thinking about a career, is there anything we didn't cover that you'd like to share now?
I guess I'll jump in and just say, I mean, I think this was already spoken about earlier that the field, particularly in industry, is still kind of at the T model stage, right? It's entering the mainstream, it's rolling out, a lot more people are adopting it, but it's still pretty new and fresh. And so if you really want to work in this field, you've probably got to hunt down those opportunities and go, but it's also a small field where you can meet a lot of the people already there. And I think the other thing is don't be discouraged, particularly if you're switching industries, particularly if you're going from academia to industry. As I was mentioning earlier, I applied, I think, for multiple roles at the Behavioral Insights team. And even I spent a lot of time interviewing at Humu before I got a role. And this was particularly because I was changing industries, going from consulting to behavioral science to technology. And for potentially that is a similar experience to what a bunch of PhD students might be experiencing, going from industry to academia, maybe back into industry or into a different industry afterwards. So don't be discouraged, I think, because it is a maturing field where people aren't always clear on what they want. And so you need to kind of find those sweet spots where there is someone who kind of understands that creativity or the tools that you're offering.
I would encourage you to come up with your narrative now of who you are. And I would encourage you to write and publish on a regular basis somewhere. It could be on your LinkedIn, it could be on Medium, but thinking about issues in the field, looking at the current news cycle, finding examples of where behavioral science was applied poorly or was applied well or could have been applied and gotten a different outcome, and publishing your thoughts regularly to start to create an identity for who you are within our industry so that people come to know you. You'll have to go out and look for jobs now, but ideally you can also get folks to come look for you. And that's a way of creating and building that narrative about yourself and having a point of view in the world that's known.
One thing I just wanted to add, I see that there are a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure there are more in Slack, at least from my perspective, but I'm sure the panelists will agree. If you want to email us afterwards, we can definitely get to these questions because many of them are really, really good questions. I saw that a lot of them had to do with, like, how do you even convince an organization to run an RCT, or how do you convince them to pay attention to this stuff? The only advice I have on that, and it's high risk, high reward, is find some organizations and become useful to them. Become useful to them because of the skill that you have, whether it's data or behavioral science. And over time, they will trust you enough to run an RCT with you. And so I think the first step is to build that relationship, and that can take a year and it can take more than a year. So sometimes we just see the final product of an RCT and we don't know that, you know, that researcher spent 2 years doing kind of silly data work that they could have done in their sleep, you know, just to become useful to that organization before they ran an RCT. So happy to talk about all those stories offline as well. But I think once you become useful to an organization, it's much easier to convince them to run your specific like love PhD topic RCT that you want to do for your dissertation.
Thanks, everyone. So this is a good stopping point. I just wanted to take a minute to thank everybody for tuning in, and I especially wanted to thank the panelists for contributing to this discussion. I think it's a fascinating set of issues. I'm excited about how the industry is evolving and looking at the work that you've been doing to help make that happen. So thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to all the panelists. So what we're going to do now is we're going to transition over into our second panel, which is the role of behavioral science in the real world, with a particular focus on research, behavioral science research during the COVID era, both into COVID sort of related work and just generally speaking, how to do behavioral science research during this time. And so we are doing a little bit of a transition. It might take a minute or so for people to show up. But just real quick, for those of you who are just joining now, the Q&A is open specifically to the doctoral students who are part of the workshop portion of this conference. So we unfortunately can't do a fully open Q&A, but if you are one of those doctoral students, feel free to continue asking your questions in Slack and we will put them up in the Q&A. And so for now, I will turn it over to Courtney Bowen, who is our moderator for this panel. And so take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you can see me okay. So I'm delighted to be here today and to join this amazing workshop. I'm going to just do a quick introduction of our panelists for today. So I'll be joined in this conversation by Michael Halsworth, who's the Managing Director of Behavioral Insights Team North America, Stravula Kusta, who's the Chief Editor at Nature Human Behavior, Neil Lewis Jr. from Cornell University, and Anna Scheel from Eindhoven University of Technology. And finally, Erez Yoeli from Applied Corporation Team. So before I begin today, I just want to point out that I'm a population health scientist. And so what I do in my work is study the determinants of population well-being. And I know that they are complex and numerous. This has only become more true as we as a nation and as a world have attempted to grapple with COVID-19, but it was true long before the pandemic. I study issues from macro level systems of inequality like racism and social class stratification, to organizational and institutional policies and practice governing pay, promotions, and work environments, to interpersonal networks and individual level behaviors and knowledge, and ultimately physiological and cellular pathways. And that's to say each of these multi-level factors plays an essential role in determining and contributing to population well-being, including public health. What this means is that any approach to understanding and addressing complex societal problems, including population health, requires that we simultaneously consider the complex interplay of a host of social, economic, political, cultural, and behavioral factors, each of which is mutually dependent, historically contingent, geographically contained, and accumulates across time and across the lifespan. So in today's session, we're going to focus on the role of behavioral science and the role that it has to play in understanding these processes as they relate both to population health as well as the host of complex problems that have only served to have been magnified in the pandemic. So to get our conversation started today, I want to open up just a general question to the panelists, which is to ask you, what do you consider to be good behavioral research? And anyone can jump in here.
So I guess I can start. I think that the set of processes that you just talked about is really important to think about together. And as practicing behavioral scientists, we often spend a lot of our time studying these variables sort of one at a time, trying to isolate their sort of independent or additive effects. And that's sort of the way we go about our daily practice, doing research to get things published and the like. But when you're doing behavioral research in the intervention space, where you're trying to intervene and say something about the world, you have to think about how those larger constellation of factors you just talked about really work together. And so I think that's something we have to be mindful of as we do this work and try to use it to intervene in the world.
So Stravula, as someone who publishes and edits a journal focused on human behavior, I wonder if you could chime in.
Sure, I wanted to delay to keep it last because I'm the only one who actually is not actively engaged in doing research anymore. So I'm a former scientist and I don't do research myself. Broadly, regardless of the current circumstances, from our perspective, a strong piece of research is one that has a well-formulated research question that was carried out rigorously, that yields results that are credible and has limitations that are transparent and clear, that is reproducible, and ultimately it pushes either science or its applications one step forward. That step forward could be either because new knowledge arises or because we have acquired greater confidence in knowledge that we already had. When considering applications in contexts, those are a way of advancing science as well. We may not learn something new conceptually or theoretically, but showing how previous theoretical work applies in a specific context, be that COVID-19 behavior change with respect to social distancing or pensions decision-making in applied contexts and so on. The general principles are the same.
Courtney, can I offer a slightly different way of getting at the question? Given that quite often many of us may be confronted with a practical problem, whether that's a policy problem or just an issue that is a problem in the world. And from my perspective, a good, if you like, setup is where that problem is meaningful. You can see why it would have an impact on the world if it were mitigated, or you could improve some outcome. So there's a kind of a meaningful, real issue there. Secondly, where you could, there is a concept or an idea, or you may formulate one specifically, but ideally you're taking an idea from the literature where there is some evidence for it, but you might want to test that in the real world or test various operationalizations of it. So you can then also find something out that contributes, if you like, to the research domain. And then finally, there is a practical means of running a kind of intervention or a piece of research. And by that I mean, for example, the behavior in question is recorded in a reliable way. There aren't flaws or inconsistencies in the way it's recorded. Ideally, it might be collected through routine mechanisms that exist already. So the cost to the organization you're working with is relatively low. And if those three things come together, it can be quite a satisfying or helpful win-win-win situation, because you ideally produce some real social impact, you contribute to the academic literature, and you do so at relatively low cost for all the parties involved.
There's one thing I would add as a consumer of research, which is all of these, well, first of all of these things to me help to contribute to useful research. So this isn't a trump card by any means, but as a consumer, one additional thing I look for is, do I understand why the particular intervention worked? Oftentimes it's been published, it works. And the question is, does it work for a reason I understand well and that I can then apply in my particular context? So I'd just like to add that one additional piece.
Yeah, that was also one of the things that I was thinking of. I think the question is very difficult for me because to me, like, it depends, I think. Like, it's very difficult to answer this question, what is good behavioral research for any sort of, in such a way that it applies to any kind of research question. I do think, I mean, the answers so far, as it's just been pointed out, are very, I think, focused on very applied sort of research on solving actual real world problems sort of on the ground. And I think that's great. I think that is an important aspect of it. And if you're trying to do that, then I think one important way of increasing the quality of the research is to really focus on the actual outcomes that count in the real world. But we do, of course, need more abstract types of research as well, like going up, building theories. So as has just been pointed out, we want to understand something about the mechanism because that makes it much easier, much more efficient for us to intervene in the, to intervene in the future without having to do it all again, maybe, or not having to do as much work again, hopefully. But also, to some extent, for its own sake, I think a lot of science is also genuinely about understanding the world, not only because we want to apply that knowledge, but also there's some aspect of it for its own sake.
Great, and so the focus of this panel, as you all were primed to come into it, was really thinking about how we could apply insights, or whether we should apply insights from behavioral science to understanding and addressing real world impacts, particularly as they relate to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I wonder if you all could reflect a bit on sort of first, does behavioral science have a role to play here? And if so, what is it? And if not, sort of what are some of the key challenges or limitations that you might imagine?
The current, if I could jump in on this, the COVID-19 actually brought behavioral science into the limelight because it's a pandemic for which there is no successful yet pharmaceutical intervention. So there is no vaccine yet, and there aren't broadly successful antiviral treatments. This means that while all the work, the pharmaceutical, biological, and associated work is happening in the background, the pandemic is essentially a behavioral issue, fundamentally, more than anything else. Behavior fuels the pandemic, and behavior also has the ability to fight the pandemic. And within this context, behavioral science and allied social sciences have had a central role to play. And I believe that's kudos to the behavioral science community for how quickly it mobilized to actually both synthesize insights from past work, but also produce novel evidence to guide the response, guide transitions at different phases of the pandemic. And I believe, I've seen it as an editor, we've seen hundreds of manuscripts since March being submitted with new research addressing specific questions where the aim is specifically to produce insight that can be applied either at the level of communication or at the level of behavior change, and lots of efforts related to surveillance, which is extremely important, behavioral surveillance data, throughout the pandemic are crucial to guide decisions and so on. So I feel that behavioral science has played and is playing and will play a key role in this context.
I completely agree with all of that. I think behavior is what, yeah, as you just said, drives the pandemic, and therefore understanding behavior and being able to predict behavior and to change behavior is a crucial part to solving this pandemic. And also not just the pandemic itself, but all the side effects that it has in our societies. I think so. In that regard, I don't really think the limits that I see for behavioral research are not so much about where behavioral research should not go, but one thing that bugs me a little bit, I think, although it's completely to be expected, is that the pandemic cuts across all disciplines, right? It doesn't care about whether something is psychological or sociological or political or medical, but all of us are experts in a very narrow, relatively narrow research area. And so when we're doing research, we have blinders on and we do focus on what we know about, what we can do well. And I think to be effective, we need to integrate more across these very narrow little bins. And we're not very well equipped to do that in a lot of fields, I think. At least that's how I experience it in psychology, certainly. And I might be underestimating how well it works in other areas. The risk that I see currently is that in normal times, I think it is more reasonable to assume that each of us does their little thing, their little narrow thing at a time, and over time we integrate these things into larger frameworks. But right now, everything is happening very fast at the same time, and everybody is competing for attention. And so one example that worries me, for instance, is that as a psychologist, I could, and I've seen studies done like this that focus on psychological aspects of, say, behavioral change. And they might play a very little role in the grand scheme of things, because it's not just about psychological factors. It's also about something like laws, for example, that have a massive effect on people's behaviors, right? And if I only focus on the psychological aspects, I'm just neglecting everything else, which is totally fine for that research question. But right now, my audience is way broader than usual, and my audience is not equipped to integrate all the pieces of information in the most effective and efficient way. And so that's why I worry a little bit right now that we're losing a lot of efficiency, that we don't get enough integration to really be effective on the societal level.
I think that's a really great point, like really great point. I'll just add something to it, which I think what can be problematic is, how can I put this? So if policymakers decide quite rightly that there is, behavior is key, as it were, to a lot of the policy issues that are being faced right now, and their way in is this concept of behavior, then they may get a relatively narrow set of advice based on what they understand to be the science of behavior, if you like. So I think the key is to make sure, if we have got that opportunity, if people are coming to us say, you do behavior, behavior is key, then not to have the kind of an overtly narrow interpretation of behavior, and to try and bring in those wider factors you just mentioned. And I think there's a responsibility right now.
To build on both of those comments, to the question of does behavioral science have a role? Absolutely. That's a no-brainer question. This behavior certainly matters in the pandemic. But I think in terms of like what our role should be, how can we be most helpful? It's not helicoptering in with, here's how my theory is going to save the pandemic. I don't think that's very helpful. I think it's partnering with other scientists across disciplines, and practitioners on the ground who they have local knowledge about how things work in their communities that is really essential for figuring out how we can marry the science with other important information in that local context to make it work. So that's the way that I've been thinking about this. I think it's almost like a straw man kind of question to say, does behavioral science matter or not? Of course it does. People are engaged with this pandemic, but we have to sort of take a step back and realize that our expertise is not the only expertise that matters, and that we are, as Anne said, we're trained in very specialized ways, and that's specialization is good for a number of things. But in this larger scale collective environment, it's a collective problem that requires many areas of expertise to work together. We have to be humble and work with others, both across disciplines within the academy and with local people on the ground who their expertise is also important to integrate and to really address this pandemic response.
I just do a really quick follow-up, which is, I think, as well, I completely agree with your point about helicoptering, the role of rapid testing in discrete contexts. So we, as an organization, did 14 trials, 14 online RCTs with cities, commissioned by cities, to try and assess the most effective messaging for sheltering in place, mask wearing, social distancing, all this kind of thing, with all the caveats that come with online trials, which we communicated. But otherwise, these cities are having to make decisions on very little evidence very quickly. So I think that's a relatively lower risk approach as well, because you're open about the caveats and you're running the tests quickly in as robust a way as possible.
So some of you have touched on this a little bit, right? So there seems to be some agreement that there is a role for behavioral research, that there's some hopes for consensus about what that role could be. I wonder if we could think about, are there harms in thinking about doing behavioral research in the midst of a pandemic, which not only requires sort of trying to advance knowledge very quickly, but trying to quickly then translate some of that knowledge into applied practice settings. And so, you know, there's definitely a role I think that we can all agree on, but I wonder if you all could reflect on if you see any potential harms and how those might best be mitigated by researchers doing this work.
The pandemic, to my mind, has brought about something that wasn't the normal mode of knowledge production or application, the mode of emergency science. And emergency science is something that the clinical sciences, for instance, are engaged in constantly. So you are constantly working against a health emergency, not in a pandemic, but for instance, in other areas of infectious disease, over in the past, or cancer and so on, where you are constantly running against time, and there is any urgency in the production of knowledge that the behavioral sciences haven't been used to. So this is a new mode of producing knowledge and application of knowledge under extreme time pressures. Policy policy works under a much faster time scale than science does. And you need to make, policymakers need to make decisions in a much, much smaller time frames. In the pandemic, that has been diminished even more, so that the time frame at which policymakers require evidence to base decisions is even shorter than, say, in fiscal decisions. This has brought about a lot of a sense of urgency and emergency that wasn't wasn't the usual mode under which science operated in the fields, for instance, that nature human behavior covers. I believe that the scientific community is trying to find its way. Perhaps the behavioral insights team or organizations working at constantly at the interface with policy were closer to that mode of working. But for the scientific community per se, that's rather unusual. This creates tensions of what sort of corners do you cut to produce knowledge quickly that will be useful, and where is the line, where can you draw the line beyond which the evidence can actually cause more harm than good. We know that our fields also suffer from constant pressure of trying to overclaim, to claim more than actually the evidence you have can get you to. In the context of a pandemic, that's extremely dangerous. So if your data has limitations, now more than ever, not if your data has limitations. As an editor, I've read thousands of manuscripts and I've handled thousands of manuscripts. I haven't seen a single manuscript that doesn't have limitations. In the context of a pandemic, when decisions have life or death consequences, being upfront about limitations and about how much confidence you can have in the outcome of your research when applied in the context of decision making for a pandemic, that is even more important now than when producing fundamental knowledge that others may go on to retest, reproduce, question, and so on. So that has become much more important, but there is a tension between what works for scientists' careers to advance versus what works in the real world to make decisions that ultimately are not harmful, and they're helpful because you've communicated appropriately how much confidence one can have in the findings.
I completely agree with all of that. I'm actually, I think the reason I was invited to join this panel was probably that I wrote a blog post in late March about exactly this. Basically, I was quite worried about at least psychological research that was coming out on COVID. So first, I completely agree that there is potential harm that we can do. Basically, if we, like, the easiest way to think about it is working on potential interventions that might help keep people safe and might help save lives somewhere down the line by, for example, behavior change. The thing is that if these inform policies that are intended to affect behavior, they might also backfire. Right? There is a risk that the effect actually goes the other way, and then we might actively do harm. I think in my area in psychology, this is something we're not used to thinking about, because I think this is a lot less common than in medical areas where you are much more familiar with harm-benefit analyses. I think that's my perception around me, is that we don't think of negative side effects of anything we do. We think it's like, it's harmless fun, sort of, at worst, right? At worst, it does nothing. But that's, in this case, that's just not true, right? If actual policies will be based on what you suggest might have a small effect, but if that's a small effect and there's some confidence interval around that, the true effect might actually be on the other side of zero, and you're not realizing that. And I think we need to be much more aware of that. But another thing that I think isn't, and then of course the fact that was also just mentioned of rushing research, meaning that quality might suffer. So not only might we not be aware of how much our effects vary and that things might not be as we think, but also we probably have weaker evidence than usual if we rush research. In particular, in psychology, for example, a lot of studies were done online because that's collecting data allows much faster data collection. meaning that actual behavior is very, very hard to study that way. And psychologists are used to using proxies for behavior, and those might not actually be valid nearly as much as we think. And so we might just be inclined to, to skip a few steps and just assume things because that's what we do in normal times research, and we think, yeah, but it correlates somewhat, it's going to be fine. But maybe this time it's not fine, and we're, again, not sufficiently aware of that. And then the third thing that I'm worried about is the opportunity cost that I think people are also not aware of, just of doing this research, of rushing it, of involving other people and helping you out. So when I wrote this blog post in March, it was just the time when a lot of countries in Europe and in North America had introduced some forms of lockdowns where everybody was finally realizing this is like serious, it's going to be with us for a while. The situation was that I knew of lots of people who had to take care of their children at home, who were really suffering from that in terms of their workload. So within academia, I felt that the workforce was greatly reduced because a lot of people had to take care of their children, for example, when on top of being extremely stressed and anxious about everything. Then a lot of people seemed to be churning out studies on COVID in some form, and the volume was so big in such a small amount of time that it just made me think, people have to review these papers. People have to read these papers. People will read these papers because people are desperate for information right now. But if your study isn't done very well, and people could have read a different paper in the same time, or just anchored their brains to it, people could have reviewed a different paper, like the few reviews that are left. Like, why do we throw everybody? You and your colleagues who have been working day and night the last 2 weeks, you could also have done something else. And maybe it was the right thing to do, but I think we're not used to thinking about that investment that we impose on ourselves and on our colleagues and on the greater public. Like when people read our preprints, which we want them to do, of course, but it's now being read by an audience that is very different from usual, that might not be familiar with our language of communicating caveats and so on. And they might all, walk away with it with an idea. And if it's wrong, you can never undo that, perhaps. And we're just not thinking about that, that risk of like not having done it. What would have happened to the person reading that if you hadn't published it?
So building off of both of those sets of comments, I think about the question of potential harms in two different ways. There's doing the research, which I think people should still be doing research if they can. That there are things that we can be learning now that might be beneficial. Let's say when the next pandemic comes around, there will be something that happens in the future that what we learn now could be helpful for. And so I have less of a problem with people doing work now. What I'm much more critical of is how we communicate that research for all the reasons that were just talked about. That we have to be careful, and Anne's blog post was also one of those things that inspired me to also express some of my concerns in this area. There was that wave of this every morning I woke up, there's sort of 5-10 new preprints about how my theory is going to save the pandemic. And there's a danger in that false hope, right? That if every day we have the new thing and yet again it doesn't work out, we lose our credibility. We give people a reason not to trust us. For the politicians, for instance, in this country to get on the news and say, scientists don't know what they're talking about. Well, why should we listen to them? So there are these other larger implications that we have to think about. It's not just about you quickly showing that you and your lab came up with a solution. There are broader collective implications of being irresponsible in our communication. And so that's something that I want us to think about. Merck CEO, one of the CEOs of the drug companies, had a similar thing about some of the early vaccine communication, that it does a grave disservice to the public to keep coming out with false hope, that we're just undermining our trust and credibility. And when we eventually have real solutions, people might not listen to us. And so, this is coming up in the pandemic. We've seen this happen in other areas as well. So I do a lot of my work in the education space. And there, this is a reaction that many teachers now have, at least in the United States, when researchers come along and say, hey, I have a new thing. Teachers, they'll smile and nod in the professional development session, but then they're not going to listen anymore, because the last time we came along with our latest quick fix intervention, it didn't work then. And this is like a pattern that they've come to expect now, is every few years, the scientists are going to come along with their next new fad. And so why listen to them? This fad will pass too. And so that danger of just undermining our trust and credibility is something we really have to think about when we're communicating. And so I think, do the science, accumulate the knowledge as we do, but really think carefully about what you're saying when you're getting on Twitter and writing your grand thread about your new paper, talking to journalists, and even posting the preprints. I mean, this is another thing that I'm torn about these days, because on one hand, preprints are good for getting rapid feedback. On the other hand, now a bunch of journalists follow those preprint servers, and we've seen over the past few months so many news articles rapidly reporting about these things. And then, the tiny line at the end, oh, this has not been peer reviewed. But that is a danger to society that we really need to think about as we communicate about our findings.
Make a really quick just point about policy making as well. So I was a UK government official for a number of years, and although I've been in the US for the last two, the researchers can do everything right in terms of rigor, caveats, and all aspects of what you're talking about. And there can be a pressure when developing briefings to but really when it comes down to it, I need to make a decision, and there may be binary choices on offer. So which is it? No, but yeah, I get there are caveats, I get that. Although obviously they may not get that because it will take a very long time. You don't have to explain all the caveats. And so it can just be extremely difficult, even with the best scientific advisory committees. Either you would come up potentially with very banal statements because you're trying to factor in all these caveats, or you will have done your work and then at some point in the chain, the nuance is removed because you need to get it into 3 paragraphs. And that's not specific to behavioral science. It's common, well-trodden ground around evidence-based making policy, so I feel like is a broader picture as well that isn't specific to our discipline.
We had an experience that's consistent with that. These criticisms are well taken, but at the end of the day, we had to figure out how to phrase a PSA. And we had to it was a best guess. It was an informed guess. It wasn't tested first. It's possible, it's likely that there were better phrasings for this PSA out there, but we did the best that we could. And based on the knowledge available to us and the best practices that we've developed in other contexts and have tested in other contexts and so on. But we did what we could in this context.
That's great. So this was really helpful. I mean, I think, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about as a population health scientist who studies in particular race and social class inequities and population health, one thing that the pandemic has really served to shine a bright spotlight on is existing fault lines in society, right? Along racial lines, social class lines. In the United States, for example, we've seen data that shows that Black Americans are 3 times more likely to be infected with the coronavirus, have death rates that are more than double that of white Americans. And so thinking about sort of the policy relevance of behavioral science and how we can apply some of the behavioral science insights to thinking about how to design policies and interventions that would help to close some of these inequities, right? That there's not going to be a universal fix to this, given that we know that the the impacts of the pandemic have been greatly unequally shared. What do you see as some of the insights or ways in which behavioral science can contribute to understanding both the factors that contribute to the stark inequities that we've seen in the COVID pandemic, and also sort of what can be done to close some of these gaps in the absence, as Sravula pointed out, of a pharmacological intervention or cure for this?
A lot of the health disparities, I mean, I guess I would start by asking the question, where are the disparities in behavior as opposed to the disparities in outcomes, health outcomes? Because you could have disparities in health outcomes that are driven by things that are not particularly behavior anchored. It could be that this is a population that's less healthy or has less good access to healthcare, which is a problem that we're not going to solve in the short term using behavioral interventions, at least for the most part. And so the first step that I would take is to ask, what are the behavioral levers that I have available to me, and are they really different across these different populations, and how can I help this particular population?
I think that's a really great point. I mean, I think in terms of thinking about behavioral insights, I'm thinking both about the levers that we can pull within the population, but then also thinking about the policy space and how we might apply some of the insights there as well. Because I think you're right. I mean, one thing that's become increasingly clear when thinking about racial inequities in particular, that these are building on the inequities that we're seeing in COVID build on legacies of racism and inequality that are sort of encoded throughout all aspects of society. But I think we can still think about how behavioral insights might be applied in a policy arena to address some of these factors.
I offer a very perhaps narrow answer to this, which is quite US focused. The pandemic has required people to access services, essential services, for example, unemployment insurance, other kinds of government support, that have been systematically, if you like, designed to impede access from various groups, marginalized groups in society, by increasing what Pamela Hurd and Don Moynihan call administrative burdens. And I think this is a really fundamental point actually about what's been happening certainly in the US, and you know, which is people have talked about more informally as kind of sludge, if you like, in the system. And you're seeing very clearly the consequences of this now as people are waiting in 8-hour-long queues to access you know, simple unemployment insurance. So I think a bigger program, which was always perhaps needed, but it's highlighted here, is removing those administrative burdens which disproportionately affect certain areas of society, and making it so that people can access as easily as possible the things which the programs are set up to deliver. I think it's a broader program, but I think it's becoming increasingly stark and necessary and urgent with the pandemic.
We've done a little bit of work in mobile health in other contexts, and one of the things that I've watched in this context is that, you know, there's a lack of mobile health being used to address some of these issues, but mobile health can increase access in a way that other technologies cannot, and without the need for people to show up. Things can be designed to eliminate some of these burdens, or at least there can be a person on the other side who can help you overcome the burdens, even if you can't eliminate them quickly. And so one area that I would look to for addressing this is, and for providing basically additional support is to mobile health. It doesn't require any extra technology. It's usually the installation of an app, and sometimes you can even avoid that.
Building on these previous comments, there is an element of political will, however, that needs to be there for any application, any intervention to take place. And that political will doesn't always exist. So clearly the behavioral sciences have circumscribed boundaries, but across the behavioral and social sciences, This is the time also for very strong surveillance. So not intervention only, but simply having the data to show how deep the disparities are and what the consequences in terms of burden of disease and mortality are of these discrepancies is extremely important. Those data are not easily available. So trying to get from the UK government, for instance, the data you need with respect to stratification by socioeconomic status and ethnicity, racial background is really not easy. And it will take a very long time for the data to become available. But behavioral and social scientists, part of the job is to actually collect those data and make those data available, on which can be used to pressure, to create political will when that doesn't exist. Yeah, I think that was my point, my additional point.
So to build on that, there's another point that I've been thinking a lot about, which is being very thoughtful as social and behavioral scientists about who is in our data and who's not in our data, and what that means for how we translate that to policy and practice. So one of the things that I've found interesting over the past month or so is looking at even changes in public opinion in the United States around the issue of reopening, and seeing how those opinions vary by race and class in the US. So one of the things that was striking is the beginning of the pandemic, there was a sort of consensus across racial and class groups that the government's priority should be public health over the economy. That has changed a bit over time, that racial minorities are still pretty strong in that belief that public health should be the top priority. White Americans have sort of reduced their endorsement of that notion that now, like, reopening the economy is a much higher priority than or is at least at the same level as the public health implications. So those changes in opinion are interesting to see given what we've seen about the racial disparities. So if we reopen, who is actually going to face the burdens of that? Which groups are at higher risk of dying from reopening? Thinking about whose voices are represented in those public opinion surveys, in other surveys that we're running, the social and behavioral sciences we've been talking about for decades, our problem of oversampling weird populations and high SES populations. We have to think about who is in the data and when we're translating that to application, and what does it mean to then prioritize some perspectives over others given these disparate impacts that we're seeing. So that's another piece of this that we have to think about is, yes, we're doing lots of science and that's good, and sometimes that science can speak to problems, but we also really need to pay very close attention to how that knowledge is being constructed in the first place.
So that leads sort of wonderfully to another question that both I had, but also came up in the Q&A, which is how do we balance this need for our science and interventions to be contextual with the desire for interventions and changes to also be widespread and of large scale, right? So I think, recently, Angus Deaton, an economist, came out with this working paper on RTCs. And a line struck me from the paper where he said, as a result that is true in one place at one time and under one set of circumstances will typically not be true in another place, another time, or another set of circumstances. So my question is, how do we reconcile this tension of wanting to both be contextually relevant and specific, but also wanting to make large-scale, broad changes? What are the data or information we need, and how can we think about this in our design of behavioral science?
So my very first response to that is, although it might be naive, is theory. I think the idea of having not just not figuring out just in one circumstance, in one specific situation, what works, but also why knowing something more abstract about why it works will make it easier to apply it in other contexts. Does not mean that you can extremely readily apply it, but it makes it easier. And I think the better we get at this, both having sort of very, very general theoretic frameworks and more mid-level theories that sort of scaffold the way from very general, very abstract ideas to very applicable ideas. I think right now is exactly a situation where a lot of, well, at least again, from speaking from my own field in psychology, I think the lack of good theory really bites right now, and it becomes more visible in that regard. And I think, so here's a very silly example. I'm bad at coming up with very good examples, but there's one thing that struck me is I've seen quite a few papers on mental health during the pandemic that sort of had this narrative that we see that people are becoming more anxious, and we need to do something about that. And people seem to be more anxious maybe when they're at greater risk or something. And the angles always seem to be that anxiety is sort of an illness, like something that's wrong with you mentally, because that's how we see it. My response always, anxiety seems to be extremely rational in the current situation. Like like you are under threat. Yeah, you should probably be anxious. It might have a function. It probably tracks your risk. It probably does something, right? And it always seems, so I then often think when I see some papers, and like, if we had sort of a more holistic theoretical framework to approach this, we might be so much more efficient in tackling these things, because we're not just faced with this phenomenon, oh, people are ill or something, there's something wrong with them, and now let's just fix that wrongness. But think, where does that come from? Like understanding the mechanism, and that it might actually make sense, for example, and then designing ways of creating good outcomes that might even be on a different level than you initially assumed, or something like that. So it's just one example where I'm a little frustrated right now with psychology, at least.
Just want to come from the completely other end of the telescope. I see, I think Angus Deaton has got many valid criticisms of RCTs, absolutely. It is worth pointing out, though, and I don't wish you to be counsel of despair, that the default in government policymaking is not to evaluate anything in any way. And indeed, the mechanisms for feeding back from evaluation to decision-making are very poor. So I completely buy that, but at the same time, it can feel like a triumph that you managed to implement an RCT and you have some evidence that something worked in one place. Now, RCTs can be very quick to implement, and in particular with communication and so on, we try to point that out. But they can require a lot of effort from people whose incentives are not aligned. And therefore, I agree, in the ideal world, we could pick holes in this and say, it may not work over there, but you're often in a world where you have no additional evaluation to rely on. And therefore, that is worth something. And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, therefore, by saying that RCTs are completely flawed. I should say, by the way, that many of these issues are explored in my upcoming book, out in 2 weeks, which I was told I had to mention by MIT Press, called Behavioral Insights. Sorry.
So to build on both of these two sets of comments, yeah, we shouldn't just throw away RCTs, but what I do think would be helpful is to move away from just thinking about the average treatment effect and thinking about heterogeneity in treatment effects. And if we understand more how the effects of an RCT or any kind of intervention vary by, say, different subpopulations within the samples, that moves us towards a place that Anne was talking about, where we can be more useful. It helps us develop more precise theories, and those kinds of theories are more useful for application. The other thing that it allows us to do is go to the table with our local partners to try and figure out how their situation compares to different conditions that we've studied. that yes, there might be some average effect, but we've seen that in this set of the sample, the effect goes in this direction, and this other set of the sample, the effect goes in this other direction. And well, your community is more like this group than by that group, so we should apply it in this way. But really, we can only get there if we move beyond the, well, there's a main effect of this and we're done. In behavioral science, it's rare that those effects are estimated so tightly that it's always going to go in that direction. There's often a lot of heterogeneity. That's what we've been seeing over and over again as we've done these larger scale trials and these many site trials. There's lots of heterogeneity that's worth exploring so that we can get to this point of useful, precise, applicable theories.
Another development in the context of the pandemic that, to my mind, has been extremely important is a greater tendency to form larger scale collaborations. So the typical mode of production in the experimental sciences, at least, is a small handful, or 2 or 3, 4 researchers working together to produce an RCT or an experiment and so on. When there is a need for sufficient information to apply in a variety of contexts and hence large-scale data, what you need is large-scale collaborations across different countries, across different laboratories. And there has been a concerted effort in several parts of the scientific community for researchers to come together and form larger scale collaborations to collect nationally representative data across a range of different countries. And that is an important development, simply because the insights would be able to apply if they're representative of the populations in a range of contexts.
I completely agree with that. I think that's a great point. I also just wanted to briefly say something about what Neil mentioned. So I think that was a really good point of having, of focusing more on heterogeneity and looking at, how, for example, treatment might affect different populations. I think maybe on a very broad level, we could say that more transparency in reporting research will be particularly helpful right now, right? Because, and I think this is also something that has been, that struck me in the last few months, is that if you look at typical titles of papers that are being published, they tend to be very general, broad, and even in the abstracts claim tend to be very like decontextualized, let's say. Very broad claim about some mechanism does some very general thing. And then the study is something very specific, obviously, and we're used to that. But right now, it seems to be more off because we realize that these specific things matter a lot, because you might not be able to apply them in the same way in different countries. They might not affect different populations in the same way and so on. So right now it becomes more salient how much that matters. And I think if we make it easier for other researchers who might want to explore these sources of heterogeneity, for example, we just being aware of that, just trying to provide as much detail as possible about exactly what we did and try to get past our usual tendency to generalize, maybe more, that might facilitate more of this sort of more fine-grained research that we need right now.
Great. Well, thanks, Julian, and thanks to all the panelists for a wonderful discussion. I look forward to the rest of the day.
Great. Thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you to everyone else who was part of this discussion. This was really interesting. We're now going to move on to our final panel. And so members of that panel can start to show their video. And this panel is going to be about behavioral science for global good, and in particular, how behavioral science may need to change in the future in order to fulfill its stated mission to make a positive difference in the world, with a particular focus on sort of weird populations, which are Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. I'm going to wait another minute or so to let the transition happen. And in the meantime, I just want to say one more time for those of you who are just joining us that the Q&A is going to be specifically for the doctoral students who are participating in the workshop portion of this conference. And so they will be asking questions in Slack, and we have some people who will be moving those questions over to the Q&A. And so those are what is going to be showing up in that Q&A. All right, so now what I will do is I will hand it over to our moderator, Neela Saldana, and I will let her take it away. And Neela, you're muted.
Classic problem. Can you hear me now? Yes, I'm very excited I can't tell you how excited I am to be moderating this panel. I told the panelists I'm a little bit in awe of how impressive they are. So you'll excuse me if I sometimes seem like I don't have any words. You'll just pick up the gap, I'm assuming. We have a really exciting panel, I think, with a wide range of interests and experience that I'm hoping will be useful for our core audience, which is the doctoral students, but also more broadly for anyone who wants to understand the interplay between academics and practice. Just a quick introduction to me. I am that interplay between academics and practice. So I spent several years in the private sector, then got a PhD in marketing at Wharton in consumer behavior in 2010, and then decided to go into industry and not into tenure track academia. So I went into the private sector and worked with PepsiCo for many years in consumer insights. And a few years ago, I actually transitioned into the social sector. I thought, I might as well use all that I had learned for good. So I went to India and set up a center, the Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ashoka University that's funded by the Gates Foundation. And the idea was around developing better behavior change programs. And as we all know, the foundation of that is good behavior science. When I was there, it really struck me about how little the behavioral science revolution has really permeated outside of what we call weird cultures, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And therefore, I'm hoping we can have a frank conversation about what needs to be done to get behavior science to the 88% of the world's population that does not live in the US and the UK and Europe and Australia and New Zealand, or what we call the global north. I'm currently an independent consultant, and I work with a number of organizations. The two main ones, which I'm very happy about, doing very innovative work in the global south. We actually have Esther from the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, and their mission is to advance behavior science for poverty alleviation in the global south. And then the Sergo Foundation does a lot of very interesting work in public health, focusing again on the global south. So that's enough about me. I just wanted to introduce our panelists very quickly. So we have Dolly Chugh. Dolly, if you can wave to everyone. She is an award-winning associate professor and social psychologist at the Stern School of Business at New York University. And of course, I won't go in detail with all of her amazing publications. I just want to say what I was very struck when I read Dolly's resume was how many things she's done outside of core academia. She has a lovely TED Talk, which I watched. It takes 12 minutes, so go watch it. She has written a book, how to be the person you mean to be, how good people fight bias. She writes a number of columns. She teaches, she's taught in a men's prison program. She's taught school principals at KIPP. And she currently has a newsletter called Dear Good People, which we should all subscribe to. So it's really interesting to see how you can combine scholarly activity with wider impact. My second panelist is Stephen Roberts. Stephen? There you are. He's an assistant professor of psychology and a co-director of the Social Cognition and Development Lab in the Department of Psychology at Stanford. He received his degree in liberal arts from the Borough of Manhattan Community College, and then a bachelor's in applied psychology from New York, and an MS and a PhD in psychology from the University of Michigan. And Stephen is interested in how people think about group boundaries. And again, I was really struck by the imagination of Stephen's research. So I loved his latest publication, God as a White Man, Conceptualizing Black People and Women as Leaders, because I think it really pushes the boundaries of what we think about as research. My next panelist, actually, Michael Muthukrishna. Michael? Hi, Michael. He's an associate professor of economic psychology at the London School of Economics. His other affiliations include research associate of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard, affiliate of the Yale Applied Cooperation Team, affiliate of Development Economics Group, and technical director of the Database of Religious History. Michael, I don't know when you sleep, with all these affiliations. What I found interesting about Michael's work is how broad it is, how it sort of takes from different groups, focusing on psychological and evolutionary processes, and even using different methodological approaches, combined mathematical and computational modeling. I'm really interested to hear from Michael about his interest in applying cultural evolution to public policy. I think that's a really interesting point, and we'll talk about that. My next panelist actually needs no introduction, and when I knew he was on the panel, I was like, oh my goodness, I may not want to moderate in front of Shinobu Kitayama. So Shinobu, can you say hello? He's a Japanese social psychologist. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, the social psychology area chair. I'm sure we all know him, referenced, done the dissertation work. I think for me, you are an inspiration and being one of the earliest to think about cross-cultural psychology. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Attitudes and Social Cognition section of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and actually had a very interesting editorial about what we need to do, among other things, to make psychology more inclusive. And very interestingly, he discovered, together with Mayumi Karasawa, discovered the birthday number effect, the subconscious tendency of people to prefer numbers and the date of their birthday over other numbers. So now I know whom to thank for that effect. And finally, I'm actually really excited to have Esther. Oh well, Esther, hi. Esther's a colleague at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. She's a labs manager, and she's worked at Busara for quite a while now. She's worked for 5 years in different capacities. She really is the person that runs all of those large-scale field research and lab experiments across different sectors, and has worked very closely with academic researchers in various disciplines. And she has a Master's of Science in Development Studies from Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology in Kenya. So Esther's here to keep it real and to tell us, how we can actually do this kind of work. So I'm going to start with Stephen. Stephen, could you tell us a bit about your journey as sort of an early career researcher, really pushing the boundaries and working around racial and ethnicity questions? And related to that, your asks from your experiences about expanding research to be more inclusive. So we'd love to hear your story of your research interests.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. How far back should I go?
As far back as it's useful to our students to know about. I think a lot of our students wrestle with this idea of, if I have this interest, when should I start? Is this something I should do during the program, once I get tenure? Like, when should I actually think about these sort of non-traditional, we might call it, interests?
Okay, yeah. So when I was going through graduate school at the one and only University of Michigan, I was very lucky to be able to explore all of my research interests. So I was pretty open and flexible to what I studied. At the same time, I tried to be practical, and I had a line of work that was less controversial, that I thought was pretty cookie cutter. So I try to balance the more controversial work with the practical work to make sure that it was all moving forward. But then when I transitioned to a faculty position, I think I started to focus more on some of the more potentially controversial questions that I've always been interested in. And specifically, we do a lot of work on how people learn and think about race, but how that thinking reinforces social hierarchies and racial inequality in the real world, especially in places where we don't typically think of it. So we do work, as you mentioned, on racism within the Christian church and how that reinforces, racist and sexist hierarchies. We've been doing work on racism in interracial relationships, which on the surface, we seem very progressive, and in many ways they are. But we have work suggesting that even those are structured by racist forces. And then relatively recently, we've been doing work on racism in our own backyard in psychological science. And that work, which it was motivated broadly by a long history of personal experiences where I was, to be blunt, pretty sick and tired of the peer review process and journals explicitly devaluing work with Black Americans, which is, I do a lot of work with minority samples, and not only devaluing the work, but dehumanizing the samples in just really creative and fascinating ways throughout the review process. So we did work on looking at, and I don't know how long I'm supposed to be talking, so I'll wrap this up in like 42 seconds. But we did work on looking at, okay, well, who's editing our journals and who's reviewing our journals and who's writing our science. And some of the major findings we have, this is a paper that came out in Perspectives a few weeks or months ago, is that most editors-in-chief in our science have been white men. And we find that under white editors, there have been significantly fewer publications on race and racism, which was unsurprising to us, but it was great for us to have documented this. We didn't mention this in the paper, but also under male editors, women are less like there are fewer publications written by women and more by men. So the basic story is that, we find that within our supposedly objective science, there's a role that our own identities play in shaping who and what gets published. So some of the calls that we're making is that we need to acknowledge that up front. We need to put systems in place that prevent that from happening. And authors, especially young students who are writing the science, need to do more work to be inclusive as well, including detailing the racial demographics of your sample, which is not the norm. I think about 80% of publications in psychology do not even mention the race of their samples. Also justifying the racial demographics of your sample. The open science movement has made a big fuss over justifying our sample sizes, which is of course an important ask, but less about justifying who we're even studying. That kind of goes unchecked and unquestioned. So we have a ton of calls, both at the journal level and participant level, toward embedding policies and norms that make our science more inclusive. And I hope that was too long.
No, that's great, and I think it's quite quite inspirational to see sort of early career researchers pushing at this issue, because as you said, there are lots of institutional barriers, but we could all do something like, as you said, publishing racial demographics or publishing the ethnicity demographics of our population, just making it more salient. Shinobu, I do want to take on the second part of that. So in your JPSP-ASC editorial, you actually spoke about the need for inclusiveness and diversity and how social context shapes human behavior. I was very struck by the fact that you stated that if the same effects occur in a sample that is very different, this could be a big plus and bring it above JPSP publication threshold. So I'd love for you to elaborate a little more about what's being done at that institutional editorial level to make space for this kind of non-weird research.
Would you like me to do that right now?
Yeah, sure.
I think this fits in nicely to what Steve said. I completely agree with everything that Steve said. In a way, I worked hard to reform the journal in our field. And so, well, first of all, probably it's useful to say a bit about myself. I came into the field about quite a few years ago, shockingly many years ago, actually, 1980s. My degree is from in 87. And back then, there was no such respectable thing like cross-cultural psychology. Steve just mentioned this issues about race, and I completely resonate with it. When I submitted a paper on, say, for example, Japanese sample to, say, JPSP, and white editor and white male editor would say that, oh, what is this? What's the American control group? To make any point about what Japanese might be doing, might not be doing. So that's my personal problematic for a long time. And a really interesting question is what we can do to make social psychology or psychology in more general more global and more inclusive in terms of gender for sure, but also race and ethnicity. So we've been doing several things. First of all, we welcome cross-cultural work. That seems like such an obvious thing to do, but it was not quite obvious, say 20 or 30 years ago when cognitive psychology provided a real paradigm for the field. So, you know, human mind is like a computer, and who cares if that computer happened to be existing in Asia or Black neighborhood or American middle class. No, that's not the case. You know, I think we made some progress in the sense that a social cultural context can shape human mind to an important extent. After all, human mind is an evolutionary adaptation so that it can survive in, you know, in a niche that's made by themselves. So once you switch the gear in such a way that you can officially and formally acknowledge significant influences of social, cultural, and ecological environment, it's very obvious that you really have to look into the impact of society, impact of culture, impact of racial categories, and so on. So that's my theoretical anchor of advocating this, you know, global, more inclusive social psychology. Now, as an editor of this journal, JPSP, it's a tricky job, right? I mean, it's an extremely competitive journal. We have to turn down, you know, more or less 90% of the papers. So just because you happen to be doing cross-cultural work, we just cannot publish that, right? So there need to be some real theoretical advancement based on your research, right? You have to demonstrate it, but what's happening in my journal anyway is that just because you are studying, say, non-weird samples, you will not be disadvantaged. You know, we have worked hard to eliminate that. And one way of achieving this end is to diversify editorial board. And again, that's something Steve had already mentioned. You know, I'm not this in that privileged category, white male. I'm from Japan, and so I myself is diversifying this editorial board. But I have worked very hard to promote, you know, people with different background, you know, African Americans, Latinos, as well as Asians and so on from different parts of the world, as much as possible, bring them in as reviewers and possibly members in editorial board. And, you know, just between me and you, I try to cherry pick some people and promote them into, you know, editorial team. You know, again, that's not affirmative action by any means. You'll be surprised. There are so many excellent people. And also your excellence is in part shaped by your role. So once you identify, you know, real talent, I think it's a responsibility of the field to promote the person so that his talent can become more visible, and so that he or she can serve in an increasingly more significant role in, you know, journal operation, or, you know, this can apply to many other domains. So yeah, I think that's one of the things I feel proud, and I think we worked, well, I myself worked hard. Always, you know, this is a project in motion, and, you know, real final outcome is in far in the future. I would not claim that we did everything we can possibly do. Anything like this is always a balancing act. journals still need to speak to a broader audience, no question. And within that framework, you need to make some reform gradually.
So it's good to know that. I think that, especially for our doctoral students, it's good to know explicitly which journals have stated that and made that sort of a requirement, or made that, as you said, without theoretical advancements, you still can't publish, just the mere presence of a non-weird sample. But it's really about getting visibility. Before we move on to sort of the broader questions around global good, I want to just come to Esther and talk about the other side of getting this kind of weird, non-weird samples, which is very often stepping out of sort of our comfort zone of, places and things that we know, and going to other places to get this. So Esther, at Busara, you've led a lot of academic partnerships, and there is infrastructure. So I'd love for you to tell people a little bit about what exists, so that if researchers, students are interested in doing work outside of, say, the global north, what could be possible models that they could work with. So could you talk a little bit about sort of the infrastructure that you have at Busara to do this?
Okay, sure. Thank you, Nila. Okay, so yeah, I'll briefly talk about Busara. And Busara is basically a research and advisory firm which is dedicated to applying behavioral science in the global south and to alleviate poverty. So Busara has the two arms, the research and the consulting arm. I'll talk more about the research arm, which is where the lab lies and which is where I work mostly. So in the research arm, so the lab, we have 3 different kinds of decision labs where we run experiments to study human behavior. So we have the stationary lab, which is basically just a physical lab where in Nairobi, where participants come in to run sessions, and we mostly deal with low-income populations. Then we have another type of lab, which is a lab in the field, and this is basically just setting up a lab where we are not able to have a physical lab. So we've been able to do this in locations here in Kenya. For example, in the western side of Kenya, where we are not able to have a physical lab. And lastly, we have a mobile lab. So there's a thin line between a mobile lab and the lab in the field, but the main difference is basically the mobile lab will move closer to the respondents, and this could be due to logistical reasons or maybe cultural differences, such as, for example, we did a study in India where we were looking at key barriers to uptake and adherence to IFA pills among pregnant women. So due to a cultural difference in this, we had to move closer to the respondents, and we had to set up a lab using a bus. So that's a mobile lab. And now, due to the current pandemic, which is, we of course know COVID-19, we've now moved to running lab in other remote data collection methods. And I'll briefly talk about, just briefly about this. So one is the virtual lab setup. So currently we are running lab experiments online through sending participants online links and through running sessions via Zoom. Then we've also designed an app which is called Kite. So in full, that's knowledge and insights tool for experiments, where researchers can design surveys on this platform. You can also, participants can also self-administer surveys on their own, and we can also do A/B testing through this platform. So other remote methods that we're using is SMS surveys and qualitative data collection through phone surveys. So I just want to briefly talk about academic partnerships, or should I?
Yeah, no, briefly just talk about that. So I think it's really useful for, and I know we're zooming in, I do want to zoom out to talk about the broader issue of global good, but just as part of our objective from this panel is to give useful information to our doctoral students and researchers. I think it's important to know that infrastructure exists. It exists in many parts of the world other than the US and the UK. And by infrastructure, one means that one doesn't need to go and find one's own research participants and set up labs, just as they exist in universities here. The mobile lab was something which I also led in India. And so obviously the ideas are still the researchers' ideas in these sorts of academic partnerships. It just makes life easier in terms of the quality of data collection. And we had a lot of a lot of learnings around the quality of data collection and ensuring that it's good data, so that a lot of your time is spent on developing the idea and doing sort of the rigorous analysis rather than trying to figure out if you're getting, the right participants or which local leader you have to get permissions from. So that's a good sort of, that's a good set of support for PhD students or researchers, early career, mid-career researchers. And I'll come back to you, Esther, more on the academic partnerships. I don't know, Michael, Dolly, if you have something to add in terms of how does one go about diversifying? How does one actually go about the process of getting, as we call, non-weird populations to be studied? Michael, you've done a lot of work in this area.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is that it's useful to be systematic about it. So instead of kind of butterfly collecting, we just want this to be non-weird, as if the world were made up of weird versus non-weird. You want to have a theory about why you're sampling a particular population compared to another. And so there are new tools like, CFST as a weird scale as a way to kind of determine just how far is this group and what dimensions are they different to what you're looking at. And then, of course, thinking not just about weird samples, but also about less weird researchers, less weird questions, and how to solve the problem of generalizability by thinking more clearly about theories that predict these things rather than, simply does this work somewhere else or does it not?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point and links back to what Shinobu said about, you don't just get something published because it's weird or non-weird. And even the weird and non-weird, I think, is sort of an artificial distinction. It's one geographical distinction, but there are other populations we've talked about in the United States about race and gender often not being seen as mainstream. Dolly, you've worked with a number of sort of what we would not call traditional populations. Can you talk a little bit about that as well? Because it seems like if we have to use behavioral science for global good, we ought to think about all sorts of populations that we want to reach with our insights.
Absolutely. Thank you. Neela, do you want me to speak about populations that we study in our samples or populations that we share what we study with?
Actually, that's a good point. Maybe you could talk a little bit about both, because I want to seg that into a question around developing a research agenda that takes into account impact. So let's start with the populations in the sample, and then maybe we can talk about the populations that you reach out to.
Absolutely. Well, I've learned so much from the other panelists already. I think one of the things that we can do, and that a lot of people probably listening already doing, are think about studies in the field to really get away from the lab model in the traditional form, or even the sort of college student sample. So one of the studies that I did with Katie Milkman and Modupe Akinola was an audit study where faculty of universities throughout the United States were our sample, about 6,000 faculty. We randomly picked one professor from every PhD granting department in the US News and World Report top 260 universities in the US. So in some ways that's still a weird sample, but it's a sample that allowed us to study exactly the questions that Stephen was raising about in our field and amongst those who hold power in our field. What do we find when we study in that particular case? The question was a cold call email from a prospective doctoral student asking for a meeting with a professor, saying, I'm interested in your doctoral program. Are you interested in meeting? A lot of us have sent or received these emails. Does it get a reply, and does the meeting get granted? And so we were varying the fictional, but it appeared real, the fictional identity of the email sender as being male sounding, female sounding, white sounding, black sounding, Hispanic sounding, Chinese sounding, or Indian sounding by name. I also think, like, I did my PhD in Mahzreen Banaji's lab. I was in a joint program, but half of my life was in her lab. And what the IAT research has shown is the power of the internet as a lab in and of itself. So implicit.harvard.edu, which originally started at Yale and is now housed at Harvard, has, I think at last count, and I'm probably lowballing this number, over 20 million tests taken on the IAT website. And it's now got such sample size that you can do data down at you can do data analysis at zip level and still have sufficient power. So that's another way where the insight that now sort of seems obvious to us, but was actually groundbreaking in sort of late 90s, early 2000s, was use the internet to find people outside of convenience samples. Now we're relying a lot on prolific amateur database, but we can still broaden beyond that, I would say. So I don't think I'm as, I don't think I've done as good a job as others have in sort of pushing beyond convenience samples, but those are two examples where I've been directly involved where I think we have.
That's great. And I think, you know, in this sort of section, we've got a number of useful topics, but also I think some structural issues that we need to work towards, which is how does the system work? How does the system reward what happens? But at least we have some ways of pushing as individual researchers, individual PhD students, whether it is collaborating with, you know, with organizations like Busara, looking, as you said, at the internet and online data collection sources, but always with a view to understanding, I think, the theoretical underpinnings of why we're studying this. I do want to come to the second part. You know, you've built a career that's just not just, you know, scholarly research worthy, but a lot of it around doing outreach and really weaving that into the work that you've done. So I'd love to know how this is shaped up, whether this was something that you started as a doctoral student. You know, we heard Stephen say early on, like you have to balance out the practical with, you know, what you want to do. How did you? I'd love to get the audience a little bit of a zoom into your research journey and career journey.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I was sitting in awe listening to Stephen's telling of his journey, and I think he's modeling for us what it means to be a scholar and to do it throughout your career. I was not as brave as him. So let me put one big frame on how I think we should be thinking about this question. We are in a period of tremendous flux in our field as social scientists. I would say the last decade has sort of challenged everything that we thought was how we do our work, whether it's the replication crisis, whether it's you know, Black Lives Matter and how we're thinking about how racism has pervaded our fields. So I think everything is changing right now. So what I want to share with you is I think the old version, and I think what Stephen is sharing is the new version. And there's probably a lot of like, let's look at kind of what people's level of what your goals are, what your risk aversion is, what your confidence is, what your courage is in terms of whether you're going to be part of the change or whether you're going to kind of work in the old version. The old version, when it comes to speaking to broad general audiences, in other words, speaking outside of our scholarly journals, is either you, and if you're in a very research-oriented university, you either don't do it or you wait until you're tenured to do it. I had 3 invitations to write a general audience book before I got tenured, and I turned all of them down, not because I didn't want to write a book. I have dreamed of writing a book my entire life. I dreamed in like it was a fantasy. I didn't even think it was an attainable dream. And then when I became a professor and it suddenly was attainable, I turned it down 3 times because I was advised in no uncertain terms it would hurt my chances of tenure. Now, I was by no means a prolific researcher as a junior scholar. So there are junior scholars for whom it would not have hurt their chances of tenure because they were still cranking out so many publications. I was not that. You know, I was the kid from high school where your parents would let you do that extracurricular thing as long as you kept your grades up. As soon as your grades fell, the extracurricular had to go. You know, that's kind of where it was. The book writing would have been the extracurricular, and my grades were, you know, I was barely sort of hanging on. So I waited till I got tenure, and then it's literally, I mean, the day I got tenure, I was like, okay, now let's go write a book. Like now, how does one write a book? Like what does that involve? So that was the approach I took. To me, I love research, but my calling is teaching. And that's what I consider book writing for a general audience to be. That's what I consider a TED Talk to be. That's what I consider teaching in a men's prison or writing a newsletter. All of those to me are teaching. And if you think about like a 2x2 in terms of who does the research and then who translates or teaches the research to others, and then it's like you versus someone else on each of those axes, you know, of research and translation. I feel for my skill set, being the translator is important to me. I don't think it needs to be important to everybody, but everybody doesn't have to translate, but somebody has to translate. And what's happened traditionally is the journalists do the translation and a lot gets lost. I heard part of the panel right before this one, and the stakes are high if you get it wrong in the translation. The panel before this one, you know, talking about within the COVID crisis. So I feel like if, you know, the saying, if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, did it fall? If a researcher discovers something useful and nuanced and no one knows it, was it ever discovered? And I'm of the stance that it wasn't. So I feel strongly that more and more of us should be very responsibly and carefully taking on the role of teaching, meaning speaking to general audiences about the work we or others do. And I personally do both. My writing curates the work of many.
It's great to hear that. I actually want to throw this open to the panel in general. I mean, this notion of balancing between what needs to be done versus how do we push for innovation. Shinobu, you mentioned in your editorial the need to obviously always publish, you know, the standard good research with the moderators, the mediators, the complete effect, that package, but then also thinking about new directions. Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So I'd love to hear how you've struck that balance. I mean, Dolly's talked in one way about it as a sort of a timeline, post-tenure, really expanding it, thinking about teaching as one way to have that impact for greater good. Michael, I'd love to, you know, you've done a lot of very interesting pieces of research and work. How have you struck that sort of balance between the research and the impact of that research?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how generalizable my approach has been. So I never really wanted to be an academic. I always kind of wanted to solve problems that I thought were important in the coming decades, like mass migration due to climate change. And I started life as an engineer, and so I kind of kept that going as a way to manage risk as I was going through graduate school. So I always focused on things that I thought were important questions for either, you know, filling in the bricks that were needed to build the house, or you know, things that, you know, like they say, the real test of a theory is in the real world. So things that connected to real problems that we were facing and can be tested in that way. I guess if there is general advice, it would be to kind of manage your risk. So have, you know, some projects that are a little bit more assured, but then also have some of the things that you think are really important and maybe a little bit more high risk. Maybe they'll show you something, maybe they won't.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's just helpful for people to see trajectories 10, 15 years out, right? Because sometimes we forget that there's a whole research and impact career in front of you, and we tend to think about it as dissertation, tenure, and then, well, we figure out what to do next. And it's just helpful to see how people have navigated that and the different sort of paths that have been taken, either pre-tenure, you know, Stephen mentioned that, or even post. As Dolly said, teaching is a form of translation. Teaching is sort of, you know, writing a book is like teaching. Shinobu, I'll just, you know, you've been one of the earliest sort of, I'd love for people to get a view of what it looks like, you know, as you look at your career and pushing at these boundaries of, as you said, when you first started working cross-cultural psychology and where it's led today. Any interesting sort of learnings from your career journey and advice you'd like to give, especially early career and doctoral students?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question. I mean, there's no single, you know, recipe for success, right? But I think it's important to have very broad thesis. Like in my case, culture, society, whatever appears to be external may be blended into the inside. So, we try to say that the human mind is a social construction, but not in the way social constructionists used to argue, that is postmodernistic argument, but more like our real machinery of the human mind may be shaped. So that's well, in retrospect, that seems like a nice challenge against cognitive revolution. Of course, back then I didn't think about that in that way. But always, I think most practical advice I would give based on this experience is not to do any research just because it's easy to do. So in my case, I address the cultural difference by running, say, really labor-intensive experiments like cognitive dissonance very early on, or recruiting very diverse subjects using very extensive kind of experimental research. And later on, we are now using biomarkers, epigenetics, brain imaging, and all that. And that's a challenging thing, especially at the time when you can collect 200 subjects overnight online. But I think the value of, say, expensive data, not just in terms of money that you invest on, but also your labor and also your intellectual labor. You really have to know the area well enough so in order to carry out, say, neuroscience research. That's a huge investment. I think in my case, that worked out. And yeah, actually, that's really broadened the conceptual frame so that something really real is being influenced by the outside. I think this kind of message was very hard to come by if you draw on traditional attitudinal scales or survey research. I mean, nothing wrong with survey research, and I've been using survey research extensively, but at the same time, there's a focus on expensive dependent variables turned out to be very important. And very few people used to be doing it anyway, so probably that's promoted chance of getting a bigger success on my part or on our part. But that's all in retrospect. When I was doing it, I was doing it because it's important to look into the inside if you really want to show that the society get under the skin.
Yeah, and I think yes, Michael.
If I might add one more thing, the other thing is to try not to do everything yourself. So if it's very helpful to look for people who are already working on a similar kind of thing, even if they're in a discipline across the road, so economics, anthropology, history, or whatever. I mean, I could tell you about two projects. One kind of mining data from dead mines as a kind of merging or creating a historical psychology, and another project in Angola and Namibia. And in the first case, there's no way we could have done it without working with historians. And in the second case, working with an anthropologist made it much more feasible. So yeah, trying not to do it all yourself.
And I think that's, and I just want to come to Esther back to the question about academic partnerships. So I think that's an important part because I'm hearing a common theme, which is about kind of embracing the risk a little bit in doing this work and how you sort of play that risk, whether you do it earlier on by constantly balancing. Stephen's done it pretty early on, I think. And we have a question for you, Stephen, from the audience on that. Or whether you do it, you take the long view of your career and you do it. And as you said, another way to de-risk is to work with other people, not doing everything yourself. Esther, I want to come back to this idea of, so there's one thing about, and you mentioned different disciplines, Michael, historians, anthropologists, but, I want to come to the other side, which is also partnering with organization or research or infrastructure. Esther, in your mind, what have been some of the features of a great academic partnership? And conversely, partnerships that didn't work out so well, just so that when our researchers know what to look out for when they're partnering with organizations like Busara.
Yeah. So I think I'll first start with the latter of what did not work well. And one thing that we normally notice when we are doing our research is that researchers come with like the westernized idea and they want to replicate it in a developing world setup. So most of the time we see that this is not likely, it's not likely to be translated, and you are not likely to apply the same kind of research that you applied in the Western setup to a developing country. So you really need to understand the context and why. That's why we work with so many local researchers and other collaborators first to just understand what context are we working in. And in all our work, I think in India, Nigeria, we have staff that really focus on first understanding this context first, and then once you understand that, you're now able to apply your research. So that's one problem that you normally get, where you just want to replicate your study without first thinking about the context. So it's very important that you work with local researchers, and this will also entail working with even local communities, community mobilizers. So we go to an extent of just hiring a community mobilizer to just try and give us a good understanding of that community. And we find that even within Kenya, so we have different communities, like in a study that is done in Western Kenya might not be applied in Eastern Kenya. And for instance, and I think I'll just give an example of one study that I worked in, and it was looking at the effect of cash transfers on psychological and mental health well-being of respondents. So the cash transfers had been done in Western Kenya, and this went well. They didn't have any challenges. But when we did this in a different kind of setup, we found that communities used to question the design, like why is it that the treatment are getting cash transfers and the control group are not getting this? So we realized, and we actually had to pause the study for a few months just to try and solve that problem, where the community does not understand the purpose of the research, the community members do not understand the study's design. So I think that is one thing that I'll really advocate researchers to do when they're thinking about replicating their studies in a developing world setup. And also we need to think about sometimes also something that I think Dolly mentioned is when you think about the sample, most of us think about university students, which is not a reflection of low income population, right? So when you're thinking about even talking about now coming to do your design and you're looking at low income population, us as Busara, we really understand that, okay, university students do not replicate the low income population. So those are some of the things that we need to think about. Yeah, so now just to come on good partnerships that we've had, and basically these are just collaborations where where researchers are open to work with local, like with our team, our staff, which have very great expertise in conducting research because of the experience. And also we also collaborate in earlier stages, like during even proposal submissions, we work with researchers to submit that. And depending on the outcome, we also implement such studies. So we work with them from the start. And another initiative that Busara now has is it's called an off the record, and it's an internal initiative where we collaborate with researchers to run very quick and rigorous research that can be done in a lab in the field. So for this, what we do is that sometimes you have an idea as a researcher, so we run this quick and very fast research, pilot research for you in our lab or in the field setup. And then you can now scale it up where you come back with now a full study where we run it because using the learnings that you got from this off the record initiative. Yeah. Then we also have visiting scholars, like scholars just coming in to observe. Maybe if you're running a pilot, they observe what happens in the lab, what happens in the field, and they're able to learn so much through that, which really now helps them in trying to think about their design there. So we usually advocate for even just visiting and trying to see, do just a pilot and see what you're doing.
Yeah. So I want to actually take something that Esther said and ask the researchers on the other side. Anyone is free to ask. So, she talked about this idea that the sort of not good partnerships are where you're just trying to translate something without understanding local context. And it seems to me pretty obvious, like no one goes in thinking, hey, I'm just going to translate something and not take into account local context. And yet it happens. So I'd love to know, why does it still happen? Assuming, to take from Dolly's work, we're all good people. We all want to do this. We all understand the importance of local context. Then why do we still keep doing this where we parachute into other countries or other groups or other areas? and still have these practices that we know are not really good practices. Anybody wants to, Michael? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because culture is like being a fish in water, right? Like you don't notice that the water's not there until you're out of it. And I mean, we talk about kind of the bubbles that we're in, liberals or conservatives or whatever. How much larger is that bubble when you start to look at people in very different life circumstances or, very different contexts, different places around the world. So I think it's just people don't see it unless they have directly experienced it themselves. And I completely agree with what Esther says. Everything goes a lot faster if you're collaborating with locals.
Stephen, I don't know whether you raised your points. You were going to say something or?
Yeah. So I agree with Michael. I think that's maybe also a more of a generous view of, some people aren't thinking about their own backgrounds. I think historically, a lot of that is motivated by, well, who's doing the initial research and what's their motivation. And if the motivation is to go into another context to prove or to show that they are somehow different than the home context, or to somehow, to reinforce that standard, then of course you're just going to go in with the same tools. And that's again, historically that's happened many times. You have a finding with some sample, you go into another context to show that they perform less well, and now you can make that comparison point. The motivation is not to understand something about that other context. The motivation is to reinforce and further the narrative of your own, of the in-group context. So I think that motivation must play a role in that.
Yeah, and then it sort of comes up against the idea that this has to have, a good, solid theoretical value, because then you're essentially saying that what I've done right now with my sort of weird population is the idea, and now that you've got to prove to me that there's something else that's different, that's, so it does play into that notion then of who judges what the theoretical value or the methodology of the value of that idea is.
Yeah, and I think, but it's also important to consider that the theoretical frameworks themselves can be flawed. In psychology, we just recently, retracted a paper published in our flagship journal, Psych Science, that was in many ways making the claim that, people in African countries are intellectually inferior, and that has these certain consequences. That was rooted in a framework that kind of sought out evidence for that to begin with. So I agree, and I think I love Shinobu's point about how the theoretical frameworks must be tight in order to really further science. I think an unfortunate reality is that historically, and to many ways still, those frameworks are rooted in a certain ideology and shaped by the position of the person putting that framework forward.
I'm going to give Dolly, you studied a lot of this, like how do we get better? How do we sort of discard the notion of just being good and actually get good-ish? And I'd love to know how we can get good-ish about doing more behavioral science for global good, being more inclusive. Any ideas, any thoughts?
Sure. The distinction I make between being a good person and being a goodish person is basically having a growth mindset. So a good person has a fixed mindset. I view myself as a good person. Most of us do. Almost all of us do. White nationalists view themselves as good people. And the moral identity researchers tell us that most of us care about being seen as and feeling like good people. But in a fixed mindset, when blind spots emerge because someone has pointed them out to us, perhaps, we will resist that information because we will do all the mental gymnastics we're so good at to protect that good person identity. A goodish person is someone who has a growth mindset, someone who's, as Carol Dweck's and colleagues' work shows, is someone who is viewing errors and blind spots as an opportunity to get better and viewing themselves as a work in progress. Whether it's doing our research or teaching our students or being, in the world that we all live in, I argue that being a good person is getting in the way of us being better people. And in this context, I would say being a good person is getting in the way of us being better researchers, because we assume, the generous view, the Michael's view about the fish in the water, we're not going to notice the water, and when we do notice the water, we're going to deny that it's water. And in Stephen's view, we're going to actually have motives that are not in any way aligned with our research, or with not our research, but with research macro. And we're going to, again, claim that we're doing this for some greater good, to use the title of the session. So I think the growth mindset is key.
Yeah, and I think it serves as a good point, which is that, you know, we keep, as Shinobu said, we keep doing this and we keep pushing against some of these boundaries. An interesting question, which is how can practitioners collaborate with scholars for a two-way flow of knowledge? If we're talking about, you know, science for global good, there's a role that practitioners play, translating knowledge to various implementation contexts, pushing back new knowledge from local contexts, as Esther talked about, to a theoretical space. What's some of the ideas around how this could happen? And I will go with anyone who wants to sort of talk about this, either their own experiences of working with practitioners or vice versa, working with academics, as Esther put it. So how do we get practitioners integrated in this knowledge and impact loop?
So I'll start by just saying part of it is we have to bring the knowledge to them in a way that we feel is rigorous to the knowledge. So it's accessible. Maybe we're not using the vocabulary we would use in our journals, but it's still rigorous in that it's preserving the meaning. So part of it is just, you know, if you're a doctoral student or early career, it might be that you just want to take small steps, or you may want to go all the way. Again, that we're in a field in flux, but it's actually making your work or the work of others available. Social media, HBR, blog, Medium posts, LinkedIn posts, giving talks, teaching executives. There's lots of ways to do it.
Yeah. I am going to give everyone about maybe 30 seconds or a minute to talk about what is the most exciting directions that you're seeing when we say behavioral science for the global good, to spark some ideas. What are you most excited about? So I don't know, Michael's nodding, maybe we'll start with him. In the next decade.
I was just nodding that it was an excellent question.
The next decade, throw out some ideas. What would you love to see more of? Or
well, I think for me, what I'm seeing that's really exciting me is this merger between, you know, behavioral science, both in economics and psychology, and cultural evolution. And I really think that's kind of the next wave of behavioral science. You know, the first wave is kind of economic models are broken, let's patch it with psychology. And the next wave is, where does that psychology come from? You know, how does it vary? And can we say anything a priori? And naturally, as an answer to that, it means moving beyond, you know, weird samples, weird researchers, weird questions, and also moving beyond kind of an empirical science into kind of a theoretical and empirical science, drawing in these kind of theoretical frameworks I've talked about a lot. So that's what's exciting me. And I see lots of examples of it, you know, across the disciplines.
Great. Anybody else want to take a crack at that? What do you see as what's most exciting in the next few years around the area of behavioral science for global good? Stephen. Yeah. Stephen, yeah.
I think Shinobu had his hand
Oh,
up.
that's okay. You go ahead.
I would say for me, you know, someone who does a lot of work on, you know, systems of racism, I think for me at a broader social level, but also at a personal level, I'm more excited toward slowly pivoting toward how can we motivate people and systems to be more anti-racist. I think that we have a lot of data on all the bad stuff, and we know that there's racism here, there's racism there. I get it, but for me personally, it's hard to work on that in the long term, and it can be pretty depressing. So I'm really excited to see the field slowly, and also my own lab, pivot toward, okay, what are the more positive things? Who's doing what well and why, and how can we maximize that?
Perfect. Yeah, that's very inspiring. Shinobu?
Yeah, well, I resonate with Michael quite a bit. Well, my own priority in the next maybe 10 years or so is to delineate the nature of diversity in non-weird world. And figuring out how this diversity might have something to do with unfolding of human cultures in the last 10,000 years. So, you know, ecology is a very important part. Population movement is also very significant. And probably, you know, something like genetic selection and surely epigenetic unfolding of human genome is very important part, and all this will feed into neuroscience and physiology, which are providing some basis for mentality. So this integrated understanding of human understanding in this time scale is a huge endeavor that's extremely important. Theoretically, to justify why diversity is crucial in getting at the most fundamental understanding of what it means to be a human.
Thank you. Dolly and Esther, I don't know if you have some thoughts on what you can throw out as ideas based on your own experience or what you're excited about behavioral science for global good.
Yeah, yeah. For me, I'll say it's mostly involving all perspectives and treating them as equal. For example, and I'll say that is now the staff that you work with. Can we try and respect them based that they understand the context better? And also participants, can we think about, for example, what incentives we give participants? Can we start thinking about, is it depending on the context, and then what stereotypes do you have in your design, and how will you try to make sure that you mitigate that? And also just because we have respect for participants, and where you have to also apply for local IRBs before you do your studies. So I just want to say, so I basically just involving all perspectives and more collaboration with maybe local researchers and people that you work with.
Great, yes.
I was just sort of having this meta moment that this conference, this panel, this day would never have happened in my doctoral program, and I graduated in 2006. So I think, to me, the sort of the future, the next thing is what we're seeing right now, whether it's this conference, whether it's the Behavioral Science and Policy Association, BSPA conference, whether it's the Harvard Gender and Work Conference, which brings together practitioners and academics. I just see tons of movement towards interdisciplinary impact beyond citations work that preserves the rigor, but pushes us to take more responsibility. And I just think that's so exciting, and this group is really exciting.
Well, thank you, everyone. I mean, I learned a lot from this, and I hope, our students and others who tuned in learned. I think one of the things which was on my mind, which is how do you actually balance this out? This is risky to do, and it's nice to hear people's stories. And I always thought that, well, one does it when one's in a position of power, whether, you're in a work environment or tenure, some safety, some security, but it was very refreshing to hear Stephen's stories of doing it quite upfront early on. So that sort of opened my mind to new models. I loved the idea of actually don't go it alone. I think that's something we don't think about, whether that's disciplines, whether that's collaborating with organizations like Busara. And then to Esther's quite a clear call for action, don't try and just come in and impose and think that you know everything, right? Take into account local expertise. So, and that also translates, I think, into some of the interesting directions, which is if you don't go it alone, you're more likely to find those interesting intersections, whether it's cultural evolution and behavioral science, whether it's ecology, whether it is, that interdisciplinary work that sort of needs to be done. So it has a double whammy effect of making it easier for you to do this work, but also finding the interesting intersections that could be much more impactful. So thanks a lot, and I hope our students found it useful as well.
Thank you very much, Neil.
Thanks for hosting, Neela.
So much.
Thank you, Neela, and thank you to all the panelists and all the moderators for all three panels. So that is the end of our panels. And so for those of you who joined us broadly from the broader audience for those panels, this will be the end of the session. Thank you so much for coming to as many of the panels as you were able to be a part of. And now what we're going to do for the students who are in the workshop itself, we're going to transition into the Zoom link that you were sent via email to start doing the smaller faculty coach workshops. So once again, thank you to everyone who was a part of this. This was really great. And hopefully this was helpful for people. Thank you.
Thank you.